Imagine a ship, not a grand warship, not a vessel of conquest, a merchant ship, heavy and slow, her hull carved from Lebanese cedar, her belly full of treasure. She is crossing the Mediterranean sometime around the year 1300 before Christ. The sea is calm. The wind carries the smell of salt and copper. Below deck, her cargo tells the story of an entire world. Copper ingots from the mines of Cyprus, stacked in neat rows like bricks of frozen sunlight. Tin from the mountains of Afghanistan, carried overland across thousands of miles before it ever touched the water. Ivory trinkets from the Upper Nile. Gold pendants bearing the seal of an Egyptian pharaoh. Blue glass beads from the workshops of Mesopotamia. Pomegranates preserved in resin. Ostrich eggshells polished smooth. Weapons of bronze, their edges still sharp enough to draw blood. One ship, and yet she carried the fingerprints of half a dozen civilizations. We know about this ship, the Ulu Barun wreck, as archaeologists would later name her, because she sank. She went down off the southern coast of modern Turkey, and the sea held her for more than 3,000 years. When divers finally reached her in 1982, they found the cargo almost perfectly intact, a snapshot of a world that no longer existed, a world frozen at the peak of its power, preserved in the silt of the Mediterranean floor like a letter sealed in a bottle and dropped into the deep. Because that world, that intricate, interconnected, astonishing world of trade and diplomacy, of palace scribes and bronze weaponry, and kings who addressed one another as brother, would be destroyed, not over centuries, not through a slow, dignified decline. It would be destroyed within a single generation. And to this day, despite everything we have learned, despite every tool of modern archaeology and science and computation, no one can fully explain why. Some mysteries from the ancient world have never been solved, not because we lack the tools, not because the evidence has been entirely lost to time, though much of it has, but because the answers themselves seem to resist understanding, as though the past has drawn a curtain across certain rooms and refused, quietly but firmly, to let us enter. Tonight, we are going to stand outside 5 of those rooms. We are going to press our faces to the glass and look as deeply as we can into history's most enduring enigmas. We will examine the evidence that remains. We will follow the theories as far as they lead. And when we reach the edge of what is known, we will stand there together and look out into the darkness beyond. Not with the frantic energy of someone searching for a solution, but with the quiet patience of someone willing to sit with a question that may never be answered. Welcome back to our cozy corner of history. If you are new here, this is a place where we explore the darker, quieter side of the past. There is no shouting here, no countdowns, no rush, no flashing lights or breathless revelations, just stories, told slowly, with the care and the patience they deserve. Tonight's journey is a long one, and that is entirely by design. We are going to travel across continents and centuries, from the sunlit palaces of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where pharaohs carved their names into temple walls 100 feet high, to the fog-shrouded peat bogs of Iron Age Denmark, where bodies lie beneath the moss with their eyes still closed. From a locked manuscript in a library at Yale University to a corroded lump of bronze poled from a shipwreck off a tiny Greek island, and finally to the cold green highlands of ancient Britain, where 5,500 Roman soldiers marched north into the mist and never came back. These are stories of disappearance, of knowledge gained and then lost, of people silenced, civilizations erased, and technologies forgotten for more than 1,000 years. But they are also, in a way that I find quietly beautiful, stories of persistence, because these mysteries have endured. They have outlasted the empires that created them. They have resisted every attempt to be explained away or filed neatly into the historical record. And tonight, they are waiting for you. Before we begin, I want to offer you a thread, a single idea to carry with you as we move from mystery to mystery, from chapter to chapter. A thread that, I believe, connects all 5 of the stories you are about to hear. It is this: what civilizations choose to forget is just as telling as what they choose to remember. We tend to think of history as a process of accumulation. Each generation learns a little more, discovers a little more, builds upon the knowledge of the generation before it. Progress moves in one direction, forward, upward, ever upward. The arrow of human knowledge points toward the light, and each century brings us closer to some final, complete understanding of the world. But that is not what happened. Not always. Not even most of the time. Sometimes the arrow reversed. Sometimes an entire civilization's worth of knowledge, its writing, its science, its art, its understanding of the stars, vanished in a single generation. And the people who came after, the children and grandchildren of those who had known, had no idea what had been lost. They could not miss what they had never been told existed.
The 5 mysteries we will explore tonight are, in their different ways, monuments to that forgetting. The first is a catastrophe so total that it erased an entire network of civilizations from the map. Around 1,200 years before Christ, every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed, almost simultaneously. The Hittites, who had Egypt to a standstill. The Mycenaeans, whose palaces inspired the legends of Homer. The great trading cities of the Levant, whose harbors had connected the ancient world like synapses in a vast shimmering brain. They fell like dominoes, one after another, and the world that rose from their ashes had no memory of what had come before. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most fiercely debated events in all of ancient history. We still do not know, with certainty, what caused it.
The second is a book, a small, unassuming manuscript, roughly the size of a modern paperback, written on calfskin parchment in a script that no human being has ever been able to read. It has been studied by medieval alchemists, by Renaissance scholars, by the codebreakers who cracked the Enigma machine in the Second World War, and by the most advanced artificial intelligence systems of the 21st century. None of them have succeeded. Not one word has been reliably translated. The Voynich Manuscript sits today in a glass case at Yale University, 600 years old, and as perfectly illegible as the day it was written. The third is not a text or a city, but a body, several bodies, in fact, preserved for more than 2,000 years in the peat bogs of northern Europe, their skin tanned to the color of dark leather by the acid in the moss, their faces frozen in expressions of eerie, unsettling calm, their deaths violent, deliberate, ritualistic. We can see them. We can study the contents of their last meals, down to the individual seeds they swallowed. We can reconstruct the ropes that strangled them, but we cannot ask them the one question that matters most. Were they willing?
The fourth is a machine, a device pulled from a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of a tiny Greek island, so corroded and encrusted with marine deposits that for 50 years no one in the museum where it was stored understood what it was. When scientists finally peered inside using X-ray technology, they found a system of interlocking bronze gears of extraordinary precision, an analog computer built more than 2,000 years ago, capable of predicting eclipses and tracking the movements of the planets across the night sky. Nothing remotely this sophisticated would be built again for another 1,500 years. The Antikythera mechanism is, by any reasonable measure, impossible, and yet it exists.
The fifth is an absence, a silence where there should be a story. Sometime in the early 2nd century after Christ, Rome's 9th Legion, Legio Nona Hispana, 5,500 battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of campaigns stretching back to the days of Julius Caesar, was stationed at the fortress of York in northern Britain. They were the empire's front line against the unconquered tribes of Caledonia. And then, without explanation, without farewell, without so much as a footnote in the Roman military archives, they vanished from the historical record. No account of a final battle, no memorial, no mass grave, just silence, as though 5,500 men, with their armor and their eagles and their names scratched into letters home, had simply ceased to exist.
These are the 5 rooms we will enter tonight, 5 doors into the unknown. I want to be honest with you from the beginning. We are not going to solve these mysteries. That is not what this journey is for. Thousands of scholars, over hundreds of years, with resources and expertise far beyond anything I possess, have tried. Some have come tantalizingly close, or believed they had. But the mysteries endure. They endure because the evidence is incomplete, because the witnesses are long dead, because the civilizations that held the answers crumbled into dust before anyone thought to write them down. What we can do, what I hope to do with you tonight, is something quieter, and I think more valuable. We can sit with these questions. We can turn them over in our hands, like artifacts pulled from the earth, examining each surface, each crack, each faded inscription. We can follow the theories as far as they go, and then we can stand at the boundary of what is known and simply be there, together, in the quiet.
There is a particular kind of beauty in an unsolved mystery. Not the frustration of not knowing, though that is certainly there, but the humility it demands. These stories remind us that the past is not a settled thing. It is not a museum exhibit behind glass, fully cataloged and neatly understood. It is vast and dark and full of rooms we have not yet entered, perhaps rooms we will never enter. And there is something strangely comforting in that, in knowing that the world still holds its secrets, that not everything has been explained, that wonder is not yet obsolete.
So settle in. Let the world outside grow quiet. Pull the covers a little closer if you need to. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do, except listen. We have a long way to travel tonight, and the first road takes us back more than 3,000 years to a world of bronze and cedar, of pharaohs and palace scribes, of trade routes stretching from the banks of the Nile to the snow-capped mountains of Central Asia. A world of astonishing sophistication and beauty. A world that seemed, to everyone who lived in it, as permanent and unshakable as the earth itself. A world that was about to end.
To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. And what existed in the centuries before 1200 BC was something extraordinary. Something that, when you step back and look at it from a distance, from the safe remove of 3,000 years, resembles nothing so much as a dress rehearsal for the modern world. A web of interconnected kingdoms bound together by trade and diplomacy, by marriage alliances and mutual dependence, by the exchange of luxury goods and raw materials across thousands of miles of land and sea. A world in which the king of Egypt could write to the king of Babylon and call him brother. A world in which a merchant vessel from the Levant could carry the products of 6 different civilizations in its hold. A world in which letters crossed borders, treaties were signed, and disputes were settled, at least some of the time, through negotiation rather than war. We call it the Late Bronze Age. And for roughly 300 years, from approximately 1500 to 1200 BC, it was the most sophisticated, most interconnected civilization the world had ever known.
Let us walk through it. Let us visit each of the great powers in turn, because each of them played a role in what was to come, and each of them was about to disappear. Begin in Egypt. Of all the kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age, Egypt is the one we know best, the one whose monuments still stand, the one whose name still carries the weight of permanence. And in the 13th century before Christ, Egypt was at the height of its power. Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, sat upon the throne of the 2 lands, and he intended the world to know it. He carved his name and his image into every surface he could reach. He expanded the temple complex at Karnak. He built the enormous rock-cut temple at Abu Simbel. Its facade guarded by 4 colossal seated figures of himself, each one 67 feet tall. Gazing eastward across the Nile with an expression of absolute, unshakable authority. Ramesses ruled for 66 years. He fathered over 100 children. He waged wars, signed treaties, and outlived most of his own sons. To his subjects, and perhaps to himself, he must have seemed eternal.
Now cross the Mediterranean and travel north to the heart of modern Turkey. Here lay the empire of the Hittites, a civilization far less famous than Egypt, but no less powerful. The Hittites controlled a vast territory, stretching from the Aegean coast to the upper reaches of the Euphrates. Their capital, Hattusa, sat high on a rocky plateau in central Anatolia, ringed by massive stone walls and monumental gateways carved with lions and sphinxes. The Hittites were formidable warriors, among the first to master the use of iron, though they kept this knowledge closely guarded, treating it as a state secret. They were also, despite their fearsome reputation, accomplished diplomats. In 1274 BC, the Hittites and the Egyptians fought one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh, on the banks of the Orontes River in modern Syria. Ramesses claimed a great victory. The Hittites claimed a great victory. The truth, as far as we can determine it, is that neither side won. The battle was a bloody, exhausted stalemate.
And what happened next is perhaps more remarkable than the battle itself. Rather than fight again, the two empires sat down and negotiated. The result was the Treaty of Kadesh, the oldest known peace treaty in the history of the world. A copy was carved in hieroglyphics on the walls of the temple at Karnak. Another copy, written in Akkadian cuneiform on a clay tablet, was found in the Hittite archives at Hattusa. The two versions differ in their details. Each side naturally framed the agreement in its own favor, but the fact of the treaty itself is extraordinary. Two superpowers, having fought each other to a standstill, chose negotiation over annihilation. A replica of this treaty hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a reminder that the impulse toward diplomacy is not a modern invention.
Now turn west, across the Aegean Sea, to the rocky, sun-bleached shores of Greece. Here lay the world of the Mycenaeans, the civilization that would later inspire the legends of Homer. The great palace complex at Mycenae, with its famous Lion Gate, its massive cyclopean walls, its royal shaft graves filled with gold death masks and bronze daggers inlaid with scenes of lion hunts. The fortress of Tiryns, whose walls were so enormous that later Greeks believed they had been built by the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants, because no ordinary human could have moved stones of such size. And beyond them, the palace at Pylos, where scribes recorded the daily business of the kingdom on small clay tablets, pressing wedge-shaped marks into the wet surface with a reed stylus, a script we now call Linear B. Linear B would not be deciphered until 1952, when a young English architect named Michael Ventris cracked the code and revealed that the language behind the script was an early form of Greek. The tablets themselves are not literature. They are not poetry or philosophy or myth. They are inventories, lists of sheep, records of grain distribution, tallies of bronze allocated to individual smiths. They are, in other words, bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, in the ancient world, was a sign of extraordinary sophistication. It meant centralized administration. It meant a literate class of scribes. It meant a palace economy capable of tracking resources across an entire kingdom. But here is the detail that haunts me. The scribes at Pylos wrote on wet clay, clay that was meant to be recycled, smoothed over, and used again the following season. The only reason their tablets survived is that the palace burned. The fire hardened the clay, preserving it by accident. We can read the final records of Mycenaean Greece only because the civilization that created them was destroyed.
Further south, on the island of Crete, lay the memory of something even older. The Minoans, named by modern archaeologists after the legendary King Minos, had built a civilization of remarkable elegance and sophistication.
The palace at Knossos, with its hundreds of interconnected rooms, its elaborate frescoes of dolphins and bull leapers and bare-breasted priestesses, its complex drainage and plumbing systems. The Minoans had been the dominant sea power of the Aegean for centuries, but by the late Bronze Age, their star had faded. The Mycenaeans had absorbed much of their culture, their artistic style, their maritime knowledge.
Crete was still important, still wealthy, still beautiful, but it was no longer the center of the world. That center had shifted to the mainland, to the great palaces, to the warriors with their boar-tusk helmets and their chariots of war. And finally, look east, beyond the coast, beyond the mountains, into the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Babylon, Assyria, the ancient empires of Mesopotamia, where writing had been invented more than 1,000 years earlier, where astronomers tracked the movements of the stars with an accuracy that would not be surpassed until the Renaissance, where the Code of Hammurabi had established one of the earliest known systems of written law. These were old civilizations, ancient even by the standards of the Bronze Age, and they formed the eastern anchor of the interconnected world.
What made the late Bronze Age truly remarkable was not any single kingdom, impressive as each one was. It was the network that connected them. We know this because of a discovery made in 1887 by a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Tel El Amarna, a site in Middle Egypt. What she found, almost by accident, as so many great archaeological discoveries are made, was a cache of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing. These were the Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian pharaohs with the other great kings of the age. And they are astonishing.
Here is the king of Babylon writing to the Pharaoh of Egypt, addressing him as my brother. He complains that the gold Egypt sent him was of poor quality, that when his craftsmen melted it down, only a small amount remained. He asks with barely concealed irritation for more. Here is the king of Assyria requesting that Egypt sent him gold as well, because gold, he writes, is as plentiful as dust in your land. Here is a Hittite queen writing to the pharaoh after the death of Tutankhamun, asking him to send one of his sons to marry her, because she will not marry a servant. The pharaoh, suspicious of a trap, sends an envoy to investigate. The envoy confirms the request is genuine. A prince is sent. He never arrives, murdered most likely on the road.
These letters reveal a world of extraordinary diplomatic sophistication. The great kings operated as equals. They exchanged gifts, negotiated marriages, mediated disputes, and maintained a complex web of obligations and alliances. Smaller kingdoms, Ugarit, Amuru, the various Canaanite city-states, operated as vassals, writing to the pharaoh with exaggerated deference, pledging loyalty, while quietly playing the great powers against one another. And binding all of this together was trade. The same trade that filled the hold of the Uluburun ship. Copper from Cyprus. Tin from Afghanistan, possibly from as far away as Cornwall in southern England. Cedar from Lebanon. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Badakhshan
gold from Nubia, ivory from Central Africa, olive oil from Crete, wine from the Aegean, perfumed oils, textiles, pottery, glass, precious stones, all of it flowing along trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting kingdoms that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and governed themselves by different laws.
But there was a flaw at the heart of this magnificent system, a structural weakness so fundamental that once you see it, the entire edifice begins to look less like a monument and more like a house of cards. Bronze, the metal that gave the age its name, the metal from which weapons were forged, tools were made, and the machinery of civilization was constructed. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, combined in a ratio of roughly 10:1. And while copper was relatively abundant, the great mines of Cyprus alone could supply much of the Mediterranean. Tin was not. Tin was rare. Tin was precious. And the nearest significant source of tin to the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean was in Afghanistan, more than 2,000 miles away, across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. This meant that the entire technological foundation of the Late Bronze Age, every sword, every axe, every chariot fitting, every palace door hinge, depended on long-distance trade routes remaining open. Tin had to travel from the mountains of Central Asia, across the Iranian plateau, through Mesopotamia, or along the coast, and into the workshops of the Mediterranean world. If those routes were disrupted by war, by famine, by the movements of displaced populations, by any of the 1,000 small catastrophes that can interrupt the flow of goods across a continent, then the supply of tin would falter. And without tin, there was no bronze, and without bronze, there was no civilization, not as they knew it. It was an elegant system. It was also profoundly fragile, a machine of extraordinary complexity, in which the failure of any single component could trigger a cascade of failures across the whole. The kings and merchants and palace scribes who maintained this system understood, on some level, that their world depended on things beyond their control, on favorable winds, on passable roads, on the continued goodwill of distant partners. But understanding a vulnerability is not the same as being able to prevent it from being exploited. And it was about to be exploited. What I am about to describe next has been called the worst catastrophe in ancient history. Not a single event, not an earthquake, not an invasion, not a plague, but a cascade, a series of blows arriving in rapid succession, each one weakening the system just enough that the next blow became fatal, like dominoes falling across an entire world. Something was coming, something was already on the horizon, and the world of bronze, that shimmering, interconnected, astonishing world, had no idea how little time it had left.
The first sign that something was wrong came not from the great capitals, not from Thebes or Hattusa or Mycenae, but from the edges, the periphery, the places where civilization thinned out and the world beyond pressed in. Letters began to arrive at the courts of the great kings, letters from vassal rulers, letters from provincial governors, letters from port cities on the frontiers of the known world. And the tone of these letters was changing. The polite formalities remained, the greetings, the blessings, the declarations of eternal loyalty, but beneath the ritual language, something new was creeping in. Fear. We have one such letter. It was found in the ruins of Ugarit, a wealthy trading city on the coast of what is now northern Syria. Ugarit sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, a port through which goods from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Aegean all passed. It was prosperous. It was cosmopolitan. Its merchants grew rich on the ceaseless flow of commerce. And in the final years of the 13th century BC, its king wrote to the king of Cyprus with a tone that can only be described as desperate. "Enemy ships have been spotted at sea," he wrote. "My troops are stationed in the land of the Hittites, and my ships are stationed in the land of Lycia. The country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." We do not have the reply from Cyprus, but we have another letter from a high official, possibly the king himself, responding to what must have been a similar plea for help. He writes with a weariness that transcends the centuries. "You say the enemy has come with ships. Even if it is true that enemy ships have been seen at sea, remain firm. Where are your troops, your chariots? Are they not near you? Fortify your towns, bring your troops and chariots into them, and wait for the enemy with great resolution." Wait for the enemy with great resolution. It is advice given to a man standing in the path of a flood. Ugarit did not survive. The city was destroyed, burned, abandoned, never reoccupied. The letter requesting help was found in a kiln, still unfired. It had been written, but never sent. Whatever happened to Ugarit happened quickly. There was no time to finish baking the clay.
And now we must speak of the Sea Peoples. That phrase, the Sea Peoples, carries with it a weight of mystery that has fascinated historians for more than a century. It sounds like something from myth, a nameless horde arriving from beyond the horizon, sweeping across the ancient world like a plague of locusts, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. The truth, as always, is more complicated, and in many ways, more interesting. We know the Sea Peoples primarily through Egyptian sources, specifically through the inscriptions of Ramesses III, the pharaoh who claimed to have defeated them in a great battle around 1177 BC. Ramesses recorded his victory on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, near modern Luxor, in a series of elaborate carved reliefs accompanied by lengthy hieroglyphic texts. The carvings show chaotic battle scenes, Egyptian soldiers in their distinctive headgear fighting against warriors in feathered headdresses and horned helmets, ships locked in combat on the water, their prows carved into the shapes of birds, bodies falling, prisoners being led away in chains. And Ramesses names them, not as a single group, but as a confederation, a loose alliance of peoples whose names the Egyptian scribes rendered phonetically into hieroglyphics: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Some of these names have been tentatively linked to known peoples and places.
The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines, who would settle along the southern coast of Canaan and give their name, eventually, to Palestine. The Shekelesh may have come from Sicily. The Denyen may be connected to the Danaans, the name Homer used for the Greeks who sailed to Troy. The Luca, mentioned in earlier records, seem to have come from southwestern Anatolia, from the region the Greeks would later call Lycia. But these identifications are uncertain, debated. Some are little more than educated guesses, and the fundamental question remains stubbornly unanswered. Where did they all come from, and why did they all arrive at once? The older theory, the one you will still find in many textbooks, presents the Sea Peoples as invaders, raiders from the margins of the civilized world who banded together and launched a coordinated assault on the great kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. This theory has a certain dramatic appeal. It gives the collapse a villain, a cause, an explanation you can point to and say, there, that is why it happened. But more recent scholarship has complicated this picture considerably. Some historians now argue that the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it, that they were refugees as much as raiders, displaced populations set in motion by the very disruptions that were already weakening the great kingdoms: drought, famine, earthquakes, internal rebellion, the failure of trade networks. Any or all of these could have pushed people from their homelands and set them wandering, armed, desperate, and dangerous, yes, but not the architects of destruction, merely its outriders.
The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single event with a single cause. It was a cascade, what modern systems theorists might call a civilizational cascade failure. Multiple stresses arriving simultaneously or in rapid succession, overwhelming a system that had been designed for stability, but not for resilience. Like a bridge engineered to bear a certain load, it holds and holds and holds, until one day the load exceeds the threshold and the entire structure comes down in seconds.
And come down it did. Consider the sequence. In the space of roughly 50 years, between 1200 and 1150 BC, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was so severely diminished as to be unrecognizable. The Hittite Empire, that vast, powerful state that had fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, simply ceased to exist. Hattusa, the great capital, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BC. The destruction was thorough. The royal archives were scattered. The great temples were reduced to rubble. And here is the eerie detail. The city appears to have been partially evacuated before it was destroyed. Many of the royal storerooms were found empty. Someone had time to remove the most valuable items. Someone knew what was coming. But knowing did not save them.
Mycenaean Greece, the world of the warrior kings, the world that would become the foundation of Greek legend, fell apart in stages. The great palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were all destroyed, most of them by fire, within a generation of each other. Pylos fell first, around 1200 BC. The final Linear B tablets from Pylos include records that suggest the kingdom was preparing for a coastal attack, rowers being assigned to ships, watchers posted along the shoreline. Whatever they were watching for, it came. With the palaces went writing itself. Linear B disappeared. Greece entered a period of roughly 400 years, from approximately 1200 to 800 BC,
in which no written records were produced. None. 4 centuries of silence. Historians call this the Greek Dark Ages, and it is not a metaphor. The lights went out. The population declined. Trade networks collapsed. Settlements shrank from cities to villages, from villages to scattered farmsteads. Skills were lost, not just writing, but monumental architecture, fresco painting, the construction of Tholos tombs, the manufacture of fine pottery, an entire civilization's accumulated knowledge, simply gone.
Ugarit, as we have seen, was destroyed and never rebuilt. The same fate befell numerous other cities along the Levantine coast. Inland, the great city of Megiddo, the city that would later give its name to Armageddon, the prophesied site of the world's final battle, was severely damaged. In Canaan, the old city-state system broke down entirely, replaced by something simpler, smaller, more fragmented. Even Egypt, mighty, eternal Egypt, did not escape unscathed. Ramesses III may have defeated the Sea Peoples in battle, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The cost of defense bled the treasury dry. In the years following the Great Battle, Egypt's power contracted. The empire lost its territories in Canaan and Syria. The great building project slowed, then stopped. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who carved and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, went on strike, one of the first recorded labor strikes in history, because they had not been paid. Their wages, traditionally distributed in grain, had failed to arrive. The system that had sustained them for centuries was breaking down.
It is difficult, from the vantage point of the 21st century, to fully appreciate the scale of what was lost. We are accustomed to the idea of progress, the notion that civilization moves forward, that each generation builds upon the achievements of the last, that knowledge once gained is never truly lost. The Bronze Age collapse is a direct refutation of that assumption. Consider what vanished: an international diplomatic system that had maintained relative peace among great powers for centuries, a trade network that spanned thousands of miles and connected dozens of cultures, multiple systems of writing, architectural and engineering techniques that would not be rediscovered for hundreds of years, artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication and beauty, entire languages, entire peoples.
The world that emerged on the other side of the collapse was smaller, poorer, and more fragmented. It was also, in some ways, more innovative. The disruption of the old order created space for new peoples and new ideas. The Phoenicians would rise from the ashes of the Levantine trading cities and develop the alphabet, the ancestor of every alphabet in use today. The Israelites would emerge as a distinct people in the highlands of Canaan. The Greeks, after their long dark age, would eventually produce the classical civilization that shaped the Western world. Iron, cheaper and more abundant than bronze, no longer hoarded as a Hittite state secret, would become the metal of the new age. But these developments were not inevitable. They were not guaranteed. They emerged slowly, painfully, over centuries, from the wreckage of something that had been magnificent. And the people who lived through the collapse, the farmers, the merchants, the scribes, the soldiers, had no way of knowing that anything would emerge at all. They knew only that the world they had been born into, the the world they had trusted to endure was ending. The ships were not coming. The trade routes were empty. The palaces were burning. The letters went unanswered.
And this, perhaps, is the deepest mystery of the Bronze Age collapse. Not what caused it, though that question remains fascinating and unresolved, but how completely it was forgotten. Within a few generations, the very existence of the Hittite Empire had passed out of living memory. The Mycenaean palaces became the stuff of myth, their builders transformed into the heroes of the Iliad, their history dissolved into legend. The interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, with its treaties and its trade routes and its letters between kings who called each other brother, all of it vanished beneath the surface of human memory, not to be rediscovered until archaeologists began digging in the 19th century.
What civilizations choose to forget is just as telling as what they choose to remember. The Greeks remembered Troy. They remembered Agamemnon and Achilles and the wooden horse. But they forgot the world that had made Troy possible. The web of alliances, the flow of tin, the careful diplomacy, the fragile interdependence. They kept the war. They lost the peace. And perhaps that tells us something about ourselves, about what we value in our stories, about what we are willing to see, and what we would rather leave buried. The dominoes had fallen, the lights had gone out, and the world would spend the next 400 years in darkness, slowly, painfully, learning to see again. But tonight, we move on. There are other mysteries waiting, other silences to sit with.
So, the world fell. The palaces burned. The trade routes emptied. The letters stopped. An entire civilization, a network of civilizations really, bound together by bronze and diplomacy, and the fragile assumption that tomorrow would resemble today, came apart in the space of a single lifetime. A person born into the world of Ramesses the Great could have lived long enough to see that world become unrecognizable. The question that remains, the question that has occupied historians, archaeologists, and climatologists for over a century, is deceptively simple. Why? What brought it down? What force, or combination of forces, could dismantle the most sophisticated civilization the world had ever known? And why, despite decades of research and excavation and analysis, do we still not have a definitive answer?
The honest truth, and I think honesty is more useful to us here than false certainty, is that we may never have a single, clean answer. The Bronze Age collapse is not a murder with one suspect. It is a patient who died of multiple organ failure, and the doctors are still arguing about which organ failed first. But the theories are fascinating. Each one illuminates a different facet of the catastrophe. Each one tells us something not only about the ancient world, but about the fragility of complex systems in general. So let us examine them one by one, with the understanding that the truth almost certainly lies not in any single explanation, but in the spaces between them.
The Eastern Mediterranean sits atop one of the most seismically active zones on Earth. The collision of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates
has been producing earthquakes in this region for millions of years, and the archaeological record of the Late Bronze Age bears the unmistakable scars of seismic violence. Mycenae shows evidence of earthquake damage. Tiryns shows evidence of earthquake damage. Knossos, Hattusa, Ugarit, Troy. All of them bear the marks of violent shaking at various points in their histories. The archaeologist Amos Newer, working at Stanford University, proposed that a series of major earthquakes, what he called an earthquake storm, could have struck the eastern Mediterranean in rapid succession during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Tectonic stress, he argued, can build along a fault line and then release in a cascade, with one earthquake triggering the next along a connected fault system. Such a storm, hitting one city after another in the space of a few decades, could have caused catastrophic damage to the physical infrastructure of the Bronze Age world: the palaces, the harbors, the granaries, the defensive walls.
It is a compelling theory, and the geological evidence supports the possibility. But earthquakes alone cannot explain the collapse. The civilizations of the Bronze Age had experienced earthquakes before, many times, and they had rebuilt. The palace at Knossos was destroyed and rebuilt repeatedly over the course of its long history. What was different this time was that the rebuilding did not happen. The cities fell and stayed fallen. Something else must have been at work, something that robbed these civilizations of the capacity to recover.
That something else may have been the weather. In recent decades, climate scientists have brought powerful new tools to bear on the question of the Bronze Age collapse, and the picture they have revealed is sobering. Analysis of pollen cores from sediment layers in the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged period of severe drought beginning around 1200 BC, precisely the moment the collapse began. Similar evidence has been found in lake sediments in central Turkey, in speleothems, cave formations whose growth rings record changes in rainfall, from caves in Israel and Lebanon, and in the analysis of ancient grain stores found at archaeological sites across the region.
The drought appears to have lasted for approximately 300 years, 3 centuries of diminished rainfall, failed harvests, shrinking rivers, and dwindling reserves. For civilizations whose economies were built on agriculture, on the annual flooding of the Nile, on the rain-fed wheat fields of Anatolia, on the irrigated gardens of Mesopotamia, this was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Drought does not simply kill crops. It sets in motion a chain of consequences that ripples through every level of society. Failed harvests lead to food shortages. Food shortages lead to social unrest. Social unrest leads to the weakening of central authority. Weakened central authority leads to the breakdown of the systems, the taxation, the redistribution, the coordinated labor, upon which complex civilization depends. And once those systems break down, they are extraordinarily difficult to reassemble. The palace economy of the Bronze Age was not designed to operate in a state of scarcity. It was designed for abundance, for the steady flow of grain into the royal storehouses, for the reliable distribution of rations to workers, soldiers, and scribes. Remove the grain, and the entire edifice begins to crack.
And when the edifice cracks, the people inside begin to push. There is growing evidence that some of the destruction attributed to external invaders may in fact have been the work of internal populations, the lower classes, the laborers, the farmers and craftsmen upon whose backs the palace economies were built. The elaborate administrative systems of the Bronze Age kingdoms were, by their nature, hierarchical and extractive. The palaces took in resources, grain, oil, wool, metal, labor, and redistributed them according to the priorities of the ruling elite. In good times, this system provided stability and a measure of security. In bad times, when the harvests failed, when the trade routes dried up, when the storehouses ran low, it became a machine for concentrating suffering at the bottom while insulating those at the top.
The Marxist historian V. Gordon Childe was among the first to suggest that popular revolts may have played a role in the destruction of the palatial centers. More recently, archaeologists have noted that at several sites, including some in the Mycenaean world, the destruction appears to have been targeted. The palaces were burned, but the surrounding settlements were left intact. The administrative centers were destroyed, but the villages survived. This pattern is difficult to explain if the destruction was caused by foreign invaders or natural disasters, which tend to be indiscriminate. It is much easier to explain if the destruction was carried out by people who lived in those villages, people who had specific grievances against the palace and its administrators, and who expressed those grievances with fire. This theory has its critics. The evidence is circumstantial. The targeted destruction could have other explanations, but the possibility is worth sitting with. The idea that the Bronze Age world was not simply destroyed from without, but that it also, in some measure, tore itself apart from within.
Which brings us to the theory that, in my view, comes closest to capturing the full complexity of what happened. It was proposed by the historian Joseph Tainter in his landmark 1988 work, The Collapse of Complex Societies, and it has been refined and elaborated by subsequent scholars, most notably by Eric Klein, whose 2014 book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, remains the most accessible and comprehensive treatment of the subject. The theory is this: the Bronze Age did not collapse because of any single cause. It collapsed because of all of them, acting simultaneously, reinforcing one another, creating a perfect storm of systemic failure from which no individual kingdom could escape because the system itself was the problem.
The drought weakened agricultural output. The weakened agriculture led to food shortages and social unrest. The social unrest diverted military resources inward, leaving borders vulnerable. The vulnerable borders invited incursions by displaced populations, the sea peoples among others, who were themselves fleeing drought and instability in their own homelands. The incursions disrupted trade routes. The disrupted trade routes cut off the supply of tin. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no weapons to repel the incursions. And so the cycle fed upon itself, each failure amplifying the next, until the entire system, that magnificent, interconnected, astonishingly complex system, exceeded its capacity for self-correction and collapsed. This is what modern complexity theorists call a cascading failure. It is the same principle that governs the collapse of electrical grids, financial markets, and ecosystems. A system of sufficient complexity becomes paradoxically more fragile as it becomes more interconnected. Each connection is a channel through which stability can flow, but it is also a channel through which instability can spread.
The very thing that made the Bronze Age world so remarkable, its interconnectedness, its mutual dependence, its web of alliances and trade routes and diplomatic relationships, was also the thing that made it vulnerable to total, simultaneous, irreversible collapse. The silence that followed lasted centuries. But silence, it turns out, is not the same as emptiness. In the void left by the great kingdoms, something new began to stir. It was smaller, simpler, less grand, but it carried within it the seeds of everything that would come after. Along the coast of what is now Lebanon, the Phoenicians, inheritors of the old Canaanite trading traditions, began to build a new kind of civilization. Without the vast bureaucracies of the palace kingdoms, they had no use for the cumbersome syllabic scripts of the Bronze Age. Instead, they developed something revolutionary, an alphabet of just 22 characters, each representing a single consonant sound. It was simple, it was efficient, it was portable, and it was democratic in a way that Linear B and cuneiform never were. You did not need years of scribal training to learn it. A merchant could master it, a sailor could scratch it into a potsherd. Knowledge, for the first time in history, was no longer the exclusive property of a palace elite.
The Greeks adopted this alphabet. They added vowels, and with that adapted script, they would eventually produce Homer and Sappho and Herodotus and Plato, the literary and philosophical foundations of Western civilization. All of it traceable in a direct and unbroken line to the collapse of a world that had been too complex to save itself. Iron replaced bronze, not because iron was superior, but because it was accessible. You did not need a trade route stretching 2,000 miles to obtain iron ore. It was everywhere, buried in the earth beneath your feet. The age of dependency on distant tin was over. The new world would be built on a metal that did not require the permission of foreign kings. And in the highlands of Canaan, far from the burned-out cities of the coast, a small and previously insignificant people began to coalesce into something that would outlast every empire of the ancient world. They called themselves Israel. Their story, their laws, their poetry, their understanding of the relationship between humanity and the divine would shape the moral and spiritual landscape of half the planet. They were, in a sense, children of the collapse, a people who emerged precisely because the old order had been swept away. But we must be careful not to romanticize the aftermath. The people who lived through the collapse did not know that alphabets and democracies and monotheism lay on the other side of their suffering. They knew only the suffering itself, the empty granaries, the abandoned harbors, the silence where there had once been the sound of commerce, of diplomacy, of a world in conversation with itself. And the deepest mystery, the one that lingers long after the archaeological debates have been catalogued and the competing theories weighed, is how completely this world was forgotten. Not destroyed, forgotten. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt in power and prestige, vanished so thoroughly from human memory that for 2,000 years the only record of its existence was a handful of references in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars dismissed those references as myth. It was not until the late 19th century, when excavations at Hattusa unearthed the royal archives, that the Hittites were restored to history. What civilizations choose to forget is just as telling as what they choose to remember.
The Bronze Age remembered how to make war. It forgot how to make peace. And the world that rose from its ashes would repeat that pattern again and again and again, for the next 3,000 years. But that is a thought for another evening. For now, let us leave the burned palaces and the empty harbors behind. Let us leave the Mediterranean and travel forward, far forward, through 2,500 years of history, to a very different kind of mystery. One that does not involve kingdoms or armies or the movements of peoples across continents. One that fits in your hands. Somewhere in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library, there is a small book. It is roughly 9 inches by 6, bound in soft, unremarkable vellum. It contains 240 pages of handwritten text, accompanied by elaborate illustrations of plants that do not exist, astronomical diagrams that correspond to no known system, and naked human figures bathing in pools of green liquid, connected by an intricate network of pipes. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows what language it is written in. No one, despite a century of effort by the world's finest cryptographers, linguists, and codebreakers, has ever been able to read a single word. It is called the Voynich Manuscript, and it has been waiting for us.
There is something uniquely unsettling about a book you cannot read. Not a book in a foreign language. Those yield their secrets eventually, with patience and a dictionary. Not a damaged book where fire or water has stolen the words. Those, at least, we understand. No, I mean a book that sits before you, fully intact, its pages crowded with writing, its margins alive with illustrations, and yet refuses, utterly and completely, to be understood. The Voynich Manuscript is that book. It has been studied by some of the finest cryptographers, linguists, and codebreakers the world has ever produced, including the very minds that cracked enemy ciphers during 2 world wars, and not a single one of them has been able to read a single verified word. It is, by any reasonable measure, the most mysterious document in human history. And tonight, we are going to sit with it for a while. Not to solve it, far greater minds than ours have tried and failed, but to understand what it is, what it contains, and why it has haunted the imagination of scholars for more than a century.
Our story begins not in the medieval period, when the manuscript was likely created, but in the year 1912, in the hills outside Rome. Villa Mondragone was once a papal residence, a sprawling estate built in the 16th century for Pope Gregory XIII, the man who gave us our modern calendar. By the early 20th century, it had passed into the hands of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, who used it as a college. And like many institutions with centuries of accumulated history, its storerooms and libraries held treasures that had long been forgotten, gathering dust in the silence between stone walls.
Enter Wilfrid Voynich, a Lithuanian-born antiquarian book dealer who had settled in London after a rather extraordinary early life. He had been imprisoned in Siberia for revolutionary activities against the Russian Empire, escaped through the frozen wilderness, and eventually made his way to the West, where he reinvented himself as a dealer in rare manuscripts. Voynich had a keen eye and a keener instinct for the valuable and the unusual. He moved through the dimly lit libraries and private collections of Europe the way a prospector moves through riverbeds, always sifting, always searching. In 1912, he traveled to Villa Mondragone,
where the Jesuits were quietly selling portions of their library to raise funds. Among the volumes Voynich acquired was a small, unassuming manuscript, roughly 6 by 9 inches, bound in soft vellum, with no title on its cover and no author's name to be found anywhere within its pages. It was thick with writing and illustration, and it was immediately clear, even to Voynich's experienced eye, that this was something he had never encountered before. The script was not Latin. It was not Greek or Arabic or Hebrew or any language Voynich recognized. The illustrations, elaborate, colorful, and deeply strange, depicted plants that did not seem to exist in any botanical reference, astronomical diagrams that followed no known celestial model, and small human figures immersed in pools of green and blue liquid, connected by elaborate networks of pipes and channels. Voynich knew he had found something extraordinary. He spent the remaining years of his life attempting to decipher the manuscript and to interest scholars in its mysteries. He believed it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and philosopher, a theory that has since been largely discredited, but which nonetheless lent the manuscript an aura of intellectual gravitas. Voynich never succeeded at decipherment. He died in 1930, and the manuscript eventually passed through his widow, Ethel, to a friend and fellow dealer named Hans Peter Krauss, who donated it to Yale University's Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library in 1969. It remains there today, catalogued simply as MS 408, a number for a book with no name. Let us now open this book together and see what lies within its pages. The manuscript contains approximately 240 pages, though some are missing. Scholars believe the original may have been somewhat longer. The vellum, animal skin carefully scraped and prepared for writing, has been radiocarbon dated to the early 15th century, somewhere between 1404 and 1438. This is important and worth dwelling on for a moment. Whatever the Voynich manuscript is, it is genuinely old. It is not a modern forgery, as some have periodically suggested. It is not a parlor trick dreamed up by Voynich himself to drive up its price. The parchment is medieval. The ink is consistent with the period. This book was made in a world where the printing press had not yet been invented, where Constantinople still stood as a Christian city, and where the 100 Years' War between England and France still raged across muddy fields.
The text is written in an unknown script, sometimes called Voynichese by modern scholars, that flows from left to right in what appear to be words and sentences. The characters are fluid, elegant, almost calligraphic, with a rhythm and grace that suggests a practiced hand. There are between 20 and 30 distinct characters, depending on how one counts certain variants, which is roughly consistent with an alphabet rather than a syllabary or logographic system like Chinese. The writing shows perhaps 2 or 3 distinct hands throughout the manuscript, suggesting multiple scribes, or one scribe whose style evolved over time. But here is what makes the script so maddening. It was not written laboriously, character by painstaking character, the way a forger might construct an invented alphabet. The script flows with the ease of someone writing in a language they knew intimately. The pen lifts, the letter connections, the subtle variations in pressure, All of it speaks of fluency. Whoever wrote this book was not pretending, they were communicating. And the text displays statistical properties that are consistent with natural language. The frequency of characters, the distribution of word lengths, the patterns of repetition and entropy, all of these follow rules that genuine languages follow, and that random gibberish typically does not. Something is being said in these pages. We simply cannot determine what.
Scholars have traditionally divided the manuscript into 5 sections based on its illustrations, since the text itself offers no guidance whatsoever. The first and largest is the botanical section. It contains over 100 illustrations of plants, roots, stems, leaves, flowers, rendered in green and brown inks with occasional touches of red and blue. They're drawn with care and evident intention, the kind of detail that suggests observation rather than pure imagination. And yet, despite more than a century of effort by botanists, historians, and amateur sleuths alike, the vast majority of these plants cannot be identified. They do not correspond to any known species in any European, Asian, African, or New World botanical tradition. Some bear a passing resemblance to real plants, a sunflower here, a water lily there, but the matches are never convincing enough to survive scrutiny. Leaves sprout from the wrong places, roots twist into shapes no known plant produces. It is as though someone painted the flora of a world slightly adjacent to our own, familiar enough to feel botanical, strange enough to defy every classification. The second section is astronomical, or perhaps astrological. The line between those disciplines was thin in the medieval world. This section features circular diagrams that resemble zodiac charts with stars and celestial symbols arranged in concentric rings. Some of the zodiac symbols are recognizable: Pisces, Aries, Taurus, but their arrangement and the accompanying text remain as opaque as everything else. There are also larger fold-out pages, some extending to nearly 4 times the manuscript's normal size, with elaborate rosette designs that some scholars have interpreted as maps, others as cosmological diagrams, and still others as depictions of specific cities or fortifications. None of these interpretations has gained anything approaching consensus. The stars of the Voynich Manuscript shine in a sky we cannot chart. The third section is perhaps the most bewildering of all. Often called the biological or balneological section, it depicts dozens, perhaps hundreds of small human figures, almost exclusively female, immersed in pools or baths of green and blue liquid. These pools are connected by an intricate network of tubes and pipes, creating what looks like an elaborate plumbing system, or perhaps a diagram of bodily processes rendered as architecture. The figures are rendered simply, almost playfully, with rounded forms and postures that suggest ease rather than distress. Their expressions, to the extent that expressions can be discerned at such small scale, seem placid, even content. No one has satisfactorily explained what these images represent. Medical diagrams, alchemical processes, spiritual purification rituals, fertility rites? The manuscript offers no answers, only the quiet insistence of its own internal logic, a logic we have not been invited to share. The fourth section is apparently pharmaceutical in nature. It contains drawings of small containers, jars, vials, ceramic vessels, alongside what seem to be plant roots and herbal preparations, some of them cross-referenced with the earlier botanical illustrations. If this is indeed a pharmacopoeia,
a book of remedies, then it is one that prescribes medicines we cannot identify, for ailments we cannot name, prepared according to methods we cannot follow, and described in a language we cannot read. It is a healer's handbook from a world whose sicknesses and cures remain entirely its own. The fifth and final section is the most text-heavy and the least illustrated. Sometimes called the recipes section, it consists of dense blocks of Voynich's text, arranged in short paragraphs, each marked with a small star or flower symbol in the left margin, as though each paragraph were a discrete entry in some kind of catalog or compendium. If the other sections are mysterious, this one is a wall. Without the illustrations to provide even speculative context, these pages are pure cipher, words upon words upon words, flowing in that same confident hand, saying something that may be profound, may be utterly mundane, and may never, ever be known.
And this is where we must pause and simply sit with the weight of what we have encountered. Here is a book, a real physical object that someone held and wrote and illustrated with evident care and unmistakable purpose more than 600 years ago. It is not a fragment. It is not a scrap rescued from a medieval rubbish heap. It is a complete work, conceived and executed with the kind of sustained effort that speaks of deep conviction. Someone, or perhaps a small group of someones, spent what must have been months, possibly years, creating this manuscript. They chose their words with the fluency of native speech. They drew their illustrations with the confidence of intimate knowledge. They organized their work into clear sections with the logic of a mind that understood precisely what it was doing and why. And then silence. No companion volume. No letter tucked inside the binding explaining its purpose. No tradition, no school, no lineage of knowledge that claims it as their own. No marginal note from a later reader saying, "Ah, yes, this is the work of so-and-so, written for such and such a purpose." The Voynich Manuscript exists in perfect, almost eerie isolation. A book without a context, a message without a sender, a voice speaking clearly and confidently in a language that no living person on this earth understands.
In our next chapter, we will explore the long, fascinating, and often heartbreaking history of those who have tried to crack its code. The brilliant minds who believed they stood on the verge of a breakthrough, only to discover that the Voynich Manuscript had one more trick hidden within its impossible pages. But for now, let the mystery breathe. Some books were written to be read. Perhaps this one was written to be wondered at. It is a particular kind of torment to be brilliant and to know, to truly know, in the deepest marrow of your expertise, that a puzzle should yield to your skills, and yet to watch it sit before you, day after day, year after year, utterly unmoved by your efforts. The Voynich Manuscript has inflicted this torment on some of the most formidable minds of the modern era. It has attracted code breakers who shattered the ciphers of wartime enemies, linguists who reconstructed dead languages from a handful of clay fragments, mathematicians who could see patterns in data the way musicians hear harmony in noise. They came to the manuscript with confidence, with method, with the full arsenal of 20th and 21st century analytical tools, and one by one they walked away with nothing, or worse, with solutions that crumbled under scrutiny, leaving them further from the truth than when they began. This is the story of those attempts. It is, in its own quiet way, as fascinating as the manuscript itself. Among the first serious scholars to attempt decipherment was William Romain Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In the early 1920s, Newbold announced that he had cracked the code. His method was extraordinary. He claimed that the visible text was merely a shell and that the true message was encoded in microscopic shorthand strokes hidden within each character, visible only under magnification. According to Newbold, the manuscript was the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century friar, and its decoded text described scientific discoveries centuries ahead of their time, including observations of spiral nebulae through a primitive telescope and descriptions of biological cells seen through a rudimentary microscope.
The academic world was electrified. Here, at last, was a solution, and what a solution it was. Roger Bacon as a secret pioneer of modern science, concealing his discoveries in an unbreakable cipher to protect himself from the Inquisition. It was a magnificent story. And it was, unfortunately, entirely wrong. In 1931, the philologist John Matthews Manley published a devastating critique, demonstrating that the microscopic marks Newbold had interpreted as coded shorthand were nothing more than the natural cracking and deterioration of dried ink on 600-year-old vellum. Newbold had been reading meaning into the random patterns of decay, seeing constellations in scattered dust. He had died the year before Manley's critique was published, still believing he had succeeded. The manuscript returned to its silence, and the first great codebreaker to challenge it was gently, posthumously undone. The next major assault came from a far more formidable direction. During and after the Second World War, the Voynich Manuscript attracted the attention of professional military cryptographers, men and women who had spent years cracking the codes of enemy nations, who understood substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, polyalphabetical systems, and every other technique the art of secret writing had ever produced.
William Friedman, widely regarded as the greatest cryptanalysis in American history, the man who broke Japan's purple cipher and who helped lay the foundations of the National Security Agency, devoted years of his personal time to the Voynich Manuscript. He assembled study groups. He applied the rigorous statistical methods that had cracked military ciphers, protecting the most closely guarded secrets of enemy governments. He fed the text through early computational analysis. He brought to the problem a lifetime of experience in which no cipher had ever resisted him for long. The manuscript resisted him entirely. Friedman eventually developed a hypothesis, never fully proven, never fully abandoned, that the manuscript was written in a constructed language, an artificial tongue invented from whole cloth, rather than a cipher applied to an existing natural language. If true, this would explain why traditional decryption methods failed. You cannot decode a cipher if the underlying language has no other record, no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription to serve as a bridge. A constructed language without a key is not a locked door. It is a wall with no door at all. Friedman died in 1969, the same year the manuscript arrived at Yale. His personal papers, eventually declassified by the NSA, revealed the depth of his frustration and the grudging respect he had come to feel for whoever had created this impenetrable text. Among his notes was a single telling sentence. The manuscript, he wrote, was an early attempt to construct an artificial or universal language of the a priori type. Even in failure, Friedman's mind reached for order.
The decades that followed brought no resolution, only new theories, each more creative than the last, each eventually collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions or the stubborn indifference of the text.
Some scholars proposed that the manuscript was written in an obscure natural language, perhaps a dialect of an early Romance or Germanic tongue, or even a form of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, which might explain the unidentifiable botanical illustrations as New World plants rendered from memory by a European traveler. These theories generated excitement and the occasional breathless headline, but none survived peer review. The proposed translations invariably required so many exceptions, special rules, and ad hoc adjustments that they explained nothing at all. Others turned to the possibility that the manuscript was a hoax, an elaborate forgery designed to deceive a wealthy buyer. The most popular candidate for this deception was Edward Kelly, the 16th century English occultist and confidence man, who served as a medium and scryer for the alchemist and polymath John Dee. Kelly was undeniably a fraud in many of his other endeavors, and he had both the motive, money, and the opportunity, access to old parchment and inks, to create a convincing fake. The manuscript's early provenance does indeed appear to connect it to the court of Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was famously obsessed with alchemy and the occult, and who reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, a staggering sum.
But the hoax theory has its own fatal problems. Statistical analysis of the Voynich's text reveals patterns of word frequency, entropy, and structure that are extraordinarily difficult to fake by hand, especially in the 15th or 16th century, long before the mathematical study of language had developed the tools to understand, let alone replicate such patterns. A hoaxer would need to invent not just an alphabet, but an entire linguistic system with the deep statistical regularities of natural speech, and to do so consistently across 240 pages without a single slip into randomness or repetition that would betray the artifice. Modern researchers using computer simulations have struggled to replicate these properties, even with the benefit of 5 centuries of additional knowledge. The idea that an Elizabethan con man could have achieved it with a quill pen and a con artist's cunning strains credulity beyond its limits. The 21st century brought new tools and new hope. High-resolution digital imaging allowed scholars to examine the manuscript at a level of detail Newbold could only have dreamed of. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the parchment's 15th century origin. Multispectral analysis revealed that the ink and paint were consistent with medieval production methods. Computer scientists applied machine learning algorithms, natural language processing, and artificial intelligence to the text, tools that can detect patterns invisible to the human eye.
And still, the manuscript held. Some computational analyses suggested the text might be a form of encoded Hebrew. Others pointed to medieval Latin with a complex cipher overlay. A widely publicized study in 2018 claimed to have identified the language as Proto-Romance, an early form of the linguistic family that would eventually give rise to Italian, French, and Spanish. The study made international headlines. Within weeks, it had been challenged, critiqued, and largely dismissed by specialists who found its methodology wanting and its conclusions unsupported by the actual evidence of the text. This is the pattern. This is the rhythm of Voynich scholarship. And it has repeated itself so many times now that it has become almost ritualistic. A researcher announces a breakthrough. The media amplifies it. Other scholars examine the claim. The claim dissolves, and the manuscript remains, patient and inscrutable, waiting for the next mind to try.
So where does this leave us? What, in the end, is the Voynich Manuscript? The honest answer, the only answer that respects both the evidence and the depth of the mystery, is that we do not know. We may never know. And there is something in that uncertainty that is worth holding, rather than rushing to fill.
Perhaps it is a genuine medical or pharmaceutical text written in a private language or personal cipher by a physician who wished to keep their remedies secret, a practice not unheard of in the medieval world, where knowledge was power and intellectual property was guarded with the intensity of trade secrets. Perhaps it is a devotional text, a spiritual document meant only for the eyes of a closed community who shared the language and took its meaning to their graves. Perhaps it is, after all, a hoax of such extraordinary sophistication that it transcends the category entirely and becomes, in its own strange way, a work of genius regardless of its intent. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that stirs something deep and quiet in the imagination, perhaps it is exactly what it appears to be. A book, written by someone who had something to say, in a language that was real to them, meaningful to them, perhaps shared with a small circle of others who understood every word. A language that lived and breathed and carried ideas and knowledge and perhaps even beauty within its flowing script. A language that, like so many others throughout human history, simply died, taking its speakers, its readers, and its meaning with it into the long silence of forgotten things. We opened this chapter by saying that the Voynich Manuscript refuses to be read. But perhaps that is not quite right. Perhaps it is not refusing at all. Perhaps it is speaking, has been speaking continuously for 600 years, and we have simply forgotten how to listen. Some silences are not empty. Some silences are full to bursting with words we have not yet learned to hear. And speaking of silence, of messages left in materials we struggle to interpret, of meaning preserved in forms we were never meant to find. Not all of history's mysteries are written in ink. Some are written in skin, in bone, in the preserved tissues of human bodies surrendered to the cold, acidic waters of northern bogs. Bodies so perfectly kept by the chemistry of peat and tannin that they emerge from the earth looking not like ancient remains, but like people who lay down to sleep only yesterday. They are called the bog bodies, and their story, or rather the many stories their silent forms suggest but never confirm, is our next chapter in this long night of unanswered questions. Rest your eyes for a moment. Let the peat water rise around us, and when you are ready, we will meet the first of them, a man with a leather cord still tight around his throat, his face composed in an expression of such startling calm that scholars have debated for decades whether it speaks of peace or of something far more unsettling.
There are places on this earth where time does not behave the way we expect it to. We are taught, and it is mostly true, that time is an acid. It dissolves. It erases. The great civilizations crumble to dust. The mighty ships rot at the bottom of the sea. The faces of the dead blur and fade until even their names are lost to the indifferent centuries. This is the way of things. This is the contract we sign with the world the moment we are born into it. Everything passes. Everything is forgotten. But the bogs did not sign that contract. scattered across the lowlands of northern Europe, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in northern Germany and the British Isles. There are landscapes where the ordinary rules of decomposition simply do not apply. These are raised bogs, formed over thousands of years by the slow accumulation of sphagnum moss, which grows and dies and grows again in layers so dense and so saturated with water that the environment beneath the surface becomes something extraordinary. It becomes airless. It becomes deeply acidic. It becomes, in a word, preservative. Wood dropped into a bog will survive for millennia. Leather remains supple. Textiles retain their weave. And human flesh, soft tissue, skin, fingernails, hair, the fine lines of a face, can be preserved with a fidelity that borders on the miraculous. The tannins in the peat water act much like the chemicals in a leather tannery, slowly converting skin into something durable, dark, and enduring. The acidity dissolves bone over time, softening it to the consistency of cartilage. But the exterior of the body, the part we recognize, the part that makes a person look like a person, can survive in astonishing detail.
This is how the bogs remember. Not in words, not in monuments, but in the bodies themselves. The actual physical remains of human beings who entered these waters hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago, and who have lain there ever since, suspended in a chemical stillness that the rest of the world cannot touch. They are called the bog bodies, and they are among the most haunting archaeological discoveries ever made. The morning of the 6th of May, 1950, began unremarkably for Viggo and Emil Højgaard. They were brothers, peat cutters by trade, working in the Bjelskuldal bog, a stretch of wetland approximately 10 kilometers west of the small Danish town of Silkeborg, in the heart of the Jutland Peninsula. Peat cutting was an old profession, and a physically demanding one. The men used long, flat-bladed spades to slice bricks of compressed peat from the bog surface, which would then be dried and sold as fuel. It was humble work, and the landscape in which it was performed was humble too. Flat, brown, windswept, the kind of terrain a traveler might cross without a second glance. On that May morning, Viggo's spade struck something in the peat that was not peat. He paused, cleared away the dark, fibrous material with his hands, and then he saw a face. It was not a skull. It was a face, with closed eyes, a gently furrowed brow, and lips pressed together in an expression so serene, so utterly composed, that the brothers' first thought was not that they had found an ancient body. Their first thought was that they had found a recent murder victim. They called the police.
The police arrived, examined the body, and quickly recognized that this was not a recent crime, or at least not recent in the way they understood the word. The body was lying on its side in a natural posture, curled slightly, as though resting. It was naked, save for a pointed leather cap made of sheepskin, secured under the chin with a hide thong, and a smooth leather belt around the waist. Around the neck, drawn tight and still knotted, was a braided leather cord, a garrote or a noose, the instrument, quite clearly, of this person's death. The authorities contacted Professor Peter Wilhelm Globe, an archaeologist at Aarhus University, who had studied earlier bog finds and who understood immediately the significance of what the peat cutters had uncovered. Globe traveled to the site and supervised the careful extraction of the body from the bog.
What he found, when the full form was finally freed from the embrace of 2,000 years of peat, would become one of the most iconic images in all of archaeology. He would come to be known as Toland Man, after the nearby village. And he is, by any measure, the most perfectly preserved ancient human being ever found. Radiocarbon dating would eventually place his death in the 4th century before the Common Era, approximately 350 BCE, during the pre-Roman Iron Age in Scandinavia. When the Højgaard brothers found him, he had been lying in that bog for roughly 2,300 years. And yet his face, that extraordinary, haunting face, looked as though he might open his eyes at any moment. The pores of his skin were visible. Individual whiskers of stubble could be counted on his chin. The lines on his forehead, etched by years of expression, remained as legible as words on a page. His eyelashes, delicate and dark, rested against his cheeks, as though he were merely sleeping.
It is this quality, this uncanny, almost unbearable lifelikeness, that sets the bog bodies apart from every other category of ancient remains. Egyptian mummies are impressive, but they are clearly dead. They have been processed, wrapped, entombed with ritual purpose. They are artifacts as much as they are bodies. The bog bodies are different. They look like people. They look like neighbors. They look like someone you might have passed on a country road without a second thought. And it is precisely this familiarity, this closeness across an impossible gulf of centuries, that makes encountering them such a deeply unsettling experience. But it is not only the preservation that arrests us. It is the manner of his death. The braided leather cord around Toland Man's neck had been pulled tight with considerable force. The furrow it left in his skin was deep and clearly defined. Running beneath his jaw and behind his ears, indicating that he had been hanged or strangled, or both. His tongue was slightly distended, consistent with death by hanging. And yet there were no other signs of violence on his body. No defensive wounds on his hands or arms. No bruising from a struggle. No indication whatsoever that this man had resisted what was being done to him. His last meal, painstakingly analyzed from the contents of his stomach and intestines, consisted of a porridge made from barley, flax, and the seeds of more than 30 different wild plants. Knotgrass, bristlegrass, chamomile. Gold of pleasure, fat hen, pale persicaria. It was a humble meal, perhaps deliberately so. Some scholars have noted that several of these plants had mild medicinal or psychoactive properties, and have speculated that the porridge may have been a ritual preparation. A final meal designed not merely to nourish, but to alter consciousness. To prepare the mind and body for what was to come.
And then there is the positioning of the body itself. Toland Man was not thrown into the bog. He was not dumped or discarded like the victim of a common murder. He was placed, carefully, deliberately, almost tenderly, on his side, in a sleeping posture, with his legs drawn up and his arms resting naturally. His eyes were closed. His leather cap was still on his head. Someone had taken the time, after his death, to arrange him with what can only be described as care. This is the detail that transforms Tolan Man from a murder victim into something far more complex and far more difficult to categorize. This was not a crime in the way we understand crime. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, ritualized, and infused with a meaning that the people who performed it understood deeply, and that we, standing on the other side of 2 millennia, can only guess at. Professor Glob, who would go on to write the definitive early study of the bog bodies, a slim, elegant volume called The Bog People, published in 1965, was among the first to articulate the theory that now dominates scholarly thinking about these finds. Tolan Man, Glob believed, was a sacrifice. Not a punishment, not an execution in the judicial sense, a sacrifice, a deliberate offering of a human life to the powers that the Iron Age people of Northern Europe believed dwelled in the bogs, in the water, in the dark and fertile places beneath the surface of the earth.
The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe as practicing human sacrifice by drowning and submersion in bogs and marshes. In his work Germania, composed around 98 CE, Tacitus noted that those who were guilty of certain transgressions, cowardice, desertion, or what he delicately called bodily infamy, were pressed into the mire beneath wicker hurdles and drowned. Whether Tacitus was describing the same practice that claimed Tolan Man's life some 4 centuries earlier is uncertain. The Roman was writing from a considerable distance, both geographic and cultural, and his account is colored by the biases and assumptions of a civilization that regarded the northern peoples as barbarians. But his words resonate with the physical evidence in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The bogs were not merely convenient places to dispose of a body. They were sacred spaces, liminal zones, places where the boundary between the human world and the divine was understood to be thin, permeable, negotiable. To place a body in the bog was to send it across that boundary, to deliver it, with all the ritual weight such an act demanded, into the keeping of forces older and deeper than any human institution. And Tolan Man was far from alone. By the time of his discovery in 1950, other bog bodies had already been found, some dating back to the 18th century when peat cutting first became widespread enough to disturb the deep layers where the bodies lay. But it was the extraordinary discoveries of the mid-20th century that brought the phenomenon into the full light of modern science and public imagination.
In our next chapter, we will meet more of them. Growlballa Man, with his throat cut from ear to ear. Elling Woman, found just 100 meters from Tolan Man, with a leather rope still knotted around her neck, and her hair still braided in an elaborate Iron Age style. Lindau Man, pulled from an English peat bog in 1984, with evidence of a death so violent, so excessive, so deliberately overdetermined, that it has been called a threefold killing: struck on the head, strangled with a garrote, and his throat cut, all in rapid succession, before his body was placed face down in the bog. We will ask the harder questions too. Who were these people? Were they criminals? Were they willing participants? Were they chosen, selected by lot or by birth, or by some quality their communities believed made them suitable messengers to the gods? And what does it mean that so many of them went to their deaths with such apparent calm, their faces composed, their bodies unmarked by struggle, their final meals eaten, their leather caps still fastened? But those questions belong to the next chapter. For now, let us stay here a moment longer, at the edge of the bog, in the gray Jutland light, with the wind moving across the heather, and the dark water holding its secrets just below the surface. Somewhere down there in the black peat, there are others,
there are always others. The earth remembers what we forget, and sometimes, in its own time, it gives them back.
2 years after the Højgaard brothers lifted Toland Man from his resting place in the Bjelskovdal bog, the earth of Jutland offered up another face. It was the 26th of April, 1952. A group of peat cutters working in the bog near the village of Grauballe, just 18 kilometers from the site where Toland Man had been found, struck something solid in the dark, compressed layers beneath the surface. They dug carefully, working with their hands once the shape of the find became clear. And slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, a second body emerged from the peat. He was lying on his chest, his limbs twisted slightly by the weight of the earth that had pressed down upon him for more than 2,000 years. His skin was the deep, burnished brown of old leather, the same tannin-cured darkness that characterized Toland Man and so many other bog finds. His hair, darkened by the chemical processes of the peat, was still thick and full. His fingernails were intact. The whorls of his fingerprints, the most intimate, most individual marks a human body can carry, were still legible on the pads of his fingers.
But unlike Toland Man, whose face bore an expression of almost transcendent calm, Grauballe Man's face told a different story. His features were contorted, his mouth was open, and across his throat, from ear to ear, ran a single deep wound, a gash so wide and so deliberate that it had severed the esophagus and nicked the vertebrae behind it. This was not a tentative cut. This was not an accident. This was a killing stroke delivered with the full force and intention of someone who meant for this man to die quickly, violently, and unmistakably. Grauballe Man had been young, late 20s to early 30s based on dental and skeletal analysis. He had eaten a last meal of porridge, similar in composition to Toland Man's, a gruel of grains and wild seeds, humble and deliberate. His hands showed no signs of heavy manual labor, which some scholars have interpreted as evidence of elevated social status, though others caution against reading too much into the absence of calluses. His bones bore no evidence of previous injury or chronic illness. He had been, by every indication, a healthy young man in the prime of his life, and someone had cut his throat with enough force to nearly sever his head from his body. Grauballe Man now rests in the Mosgard Museum near Aarhus, Denmark, where he has been since his preservation through an experimental tanning process in the 1950s. Unlike Toland Man, whose body below the neck was not preserved, only his head and feet survive in their original state, the rest having been allowed to deteriorate before modern conservation techniques could be applied, Grauballe Man's entire body was saved. He lies in a glass case in a dimly lit room, and visitors who come to see him often report the same reaction, a sharp, almost physical shock at how human he looks, how present, how close.
This is the quality that makes the bog bodies so fundamentally different from any other encounter with the ancient dead. A Roman tombstone tells you someone existed. A medieval skeleton tells you someone died. But a bog body tells you someone was alive. Alive in a way that your nervous system recognizes before your rational mind can intervene. You see the pores of their skin, the creases around their eyes, the texture of their hair, and something deep and involuntary responds. You are not looking at remains. You are looking at a person.
and the gulf between those two experiences is vast. Grauballi Man and Tulland Man were the most celebrated discoveries, but they were far from the only ones. The bogs of northern Europe have yielded hundreds of human remains, some fragmentary, reduced to a single limb or a patch of skin, and others remarkably complete. And as the catalogue of finds grew across the 20th century, a pattern began to emerge that was as troubling as it was unmistakable. These people had been killed, deliberately, ritually, and often with a degree of violence that far exceeded what would be necessary to end a life.
Consider Lindau Man, discovered in a peat bog at Lindau Moss in Cheshire, England, in August of 1984. He was a young man, mid-20s, well-built, with trimmed hair and a neatly groomed beard. Details preserved by the same chemical miracle that had saved Toland Man and Grauballi Man. His last meal had included unleavened bread, possibly made with mistletoe pollen, a plant with deep significance in the Druidic traditions of Iron Age Britain. And his death had been extraordinary in its thoroughness. Lindau Man had been struck twice on the crown of the head with a heavy, narrow object, an axe most likely, with enough force to drive fragments of skull into his brain. He had been garroted, a knotted cord tightened around his neck until the vertebrae cracked under the pressure. And his throat had been cut, deeply and cleanly, in a wound nearly identical in its placement and severity to Grauballi Man's. 3 methods of killing, applied in rapid succession to a single individual. Not one of them would have been survivable on its own. Together, they constitute what archaeologists have come to call overkill, a deliberate excess of violence that cannot be explained by simple murder, judicial execution, or battlefield death. You do not strike a man on the head, strangle him with a garrote, and cut his throat because you want him dead. One of those acts would suffice. You do all 3 because each act carries a meaning beyond the physical, because each method of death is a message, a ritual gesture, an offering, directed not at the victim, but at something beyond him.
This pattern, the threefold death, the ritual overkill, the deliberate layering of violence upon violence, appears in enough bog body discoveries to suggest a widespread and deeply embedded practice across Iron Age Northern Europe. Not every bog body shows evidence of multiple killing methods. Some, like Toland Man, were hanged or strangled with a single cord. Others, like Elling Woman, found just 100 meters from Toland Man in 1938, with a leather rope around her neck and her hair still arranged in an elaborate braid, show evidence of a single deliberate act of killing, followed by careful placement in the bog. But the recurrence of overkill in the more prominent finds has led scholars to propose that the number and nature of the killing methods were not arbitrary. They were prescribed. They were part of a script, a liturgy of death whose precise meaning was known to the participants, but has been lost to us entirely. The question that naturally follows, the question that every visitor to the Silkenborg Museum or the Mosgard Museum or the British Museum inevitably asks, is the most human question of all. Why? The theories are numerous, and none of them is entirely satisfying.
The oldest and persistent theory draws on Tacitus and proposes that the bog bodies were criminals or social outcasts, individuals who had violated the laws or norms of their communities and were punished by being surrendered to the bogs. Tacitus described deserters and cowards being submerged in marshes beneath wicker hurdles, and for many years this passage served as the primary interpretive framework for the finds. The bog, in this reading, was a place of punishment and shame, a dumping ground for the unworthy, where the very earth would swallow them and erase them from the memory of the living. But this theory has never been comfortable. It does not explain the care with which many of the bodies were positioned. It does not explain the ritual meals. It does not explain the elaborate hair arrangements, the leather caps, the belts and garments that were left on some of the bodies, as though they still mattered, as though the person inside them still deserved to be clothed and adorned. You do not braid a condemned criminal's hair before execution. You do not feed them a carefully prepared porridge of selected grains and seeds. You do not close their eyes and lay them on their side in a posture of sleep. These are not the gestures of punishment. These are the gestures of something else entirely.
The second major theory, and the one that has gained the most traction among modern scholars, is that the bog bodies were sacrificial victims offered to the gods. The Iron Age peoples of Northern Europe worshipped a pantheon of deities associated with fertility, war, and the natural world. The bogs, as liminal spaces, neither land nor water, neither living nor dead, were understood as thresholds between the human realm and the divine. To place a body in the bog was to send it across that threshold. The killing methods, hanging, strangulation, throat cutting, may have corresponded to specific deities or specific purposes. A death by hanging for Odin, the god of the gallows. A death by drowning for Nerthus, the earth goddess, whom Tacitus described as receiving sacrifices in a sacred lake. A threefold death for a threefold purpose, an offering so complete, so excessive in its generosity, that no god could refuse it. The third theory, more recent and more controversial, proposes that the bog bodies were not outcasts or random sacrificial victims, but individuals of high status, perhaps even kings or chieftains, who were offered willingly in times of crisis. A failed harvest, a lost war, a plague. In such moments, the thinking goes, the most powerful offering a community could make was not a slave or a criminal, but someone of genuine value, someone whose death would cost the community dearly and would therefore demonstrate the sincerity and desperation of their appeal to the divine. This theory finds support in the physical condition of some of the bodies, the well-nourished frames, the uncalloused hands, the carefully maintained hair and nails, and in the evident care with which they were buried. These were not disposable people. These were people who mattered, and perhaps that was precisely the point.
And yet, even the most persuasive of these theories is, in the end, a story we are telling ourselves about people who cannot confirm or deny a word of it. This is the deepest and most unsettling truth of the bog bodies. They are the most physically intimate connection we will ever have with the ancient world. We can see their faces, we can count their eyelashes, we can analyze the contents of their stomachs and know to the individual seed what they ate on the last day of their lives. We are closer to these people than we are to most of the named kings and queens of the same era, whose bodies have long since crumbled to anonymous bone. And yet, we do not know their names. We do not know their words. We do not know whether they went to the bog willingly or in terror, whether they believed their deaths would save their communities or destroy their souls, whether the hands that tightened the cord around their necks belonged to enemies or to people who loved them. The intimacy is physical. The distance is total. We can touch their skin, but we cannot reach their minds. This is the particular cruelty and the particular beauty of the bog bodies as a historical mystery. They do not withhold their evidence, they offer it with an almost overwhelming generosity. Here is my face, here is my hair, here is the meal I ate before I died, here is the cord that killed me. But when we lean in closer, when we ask the questions that matter most, who were you? What did you believe? Were you afraid? They answer with the same silence they have maintained for 2,000 years.
Some mysteries are made of missing evidence. The Bronze Age collapse leaves us with ruins and silence where records should be. The Voynich Manuscript presents us with words we cannot read. But the bog bodies are a different kind of mystery altogether. They give us everything except meaning. The evidence is perfect, the interpretation is impossible, and the gap between what we can see and what we can understand is wide enough to hold every theory, every projection, and every unanswerable question the human mind can generate. Perhaps that is why they move us so deeply, not because they are ancient, but because they are close, not because they are strange, but because they are familiar. They remind us that the distance between the living and the dead is not measured in centuries. It is measured in the single unbridgeable space between a face we can see and a mind we can never know. And it is minds, brilliant, restless, extraordinary minds, that call us forward now, away from the bogs, away from the cold peat and the silent faces and the wind across the Jutland heath. We are going south, and we are going deep, not into the earth this time, but into the sea, to the floor of the Mediterranean, where in the year 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers sheltering from a storm discovered something on the seabed that would rewrite our understanding of what the ancient world was capable of building. It was encrusted with coral. It was green with the patina of 2,000 years beneath the waves. And inside its corroded bronze casing were gears, dozens of interlocking gears, precisely cut and carefully calibrated, forming a mechanism so sophisticated that nothing remotely comparable would be built in Europe for another 14 centuries. It is called the Antikythera mechanism, and it is, quite simply, impossible, until you hold it in your hands and accept that it is real. Settle in, let the water close over us, and let us see what the ancients built before the world forgot how. There is something almost unbearable about the idea that the past was smarter than we thought. Not in the way we flatter ourselves when we imagine ancient peoples gazing up at the stars with wonder, but in the concrete, mechanical, engineering sense, the kind of intelligence that bends metal into gears, the kind that calculates the movement of celestial bodies with a precision that would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. This is the story of a machine that should not exist, a device pulled from the bottom of the sea that rewrote our understanding of what the ancient world was capable of, and, perhaps more unsettlingly, forced us to confront a question we had never thought to ask. What else did they build that we have lost? It begins, as so many great discoveries do, not with scientists or scholars, but with working men, men whose hands were calloused and whose lungs were trained to hold breath in the cold, dark water, men who dove not for knowledge, but for sponges. In the spring of 1900, a small crew of Greek sponge divers from the island of Symi were making their way home through the Aegean Sea. They had spent weeks harvesting sponges along the coast of North Africa, back-breaking, dangerous work that required diving to depths that would terrify most modern swimmers. These were men who lived on the edge of drowning as a matter of profession. They understood the sea not as a romantic abstraction, but as a workplace,
a place where your lungs burned and your ears screamed and the pressure squeezed your skull like a vice.
Their boat, captained by a man named Demetrius Kontos, was passing near the small rocky island of Antikythera, a sliver of land wedged between Crete and the Peloponnese, barely significant enough to appear on most maps. The weather turned, as it often does in that part of the Mediterranean, and the crew decided to anchor near the island and wait out the wind. And because these were sponge divers, and because the sea was right there, and because idle hands are a luxury working men cannot afford, they dove. A diver named Elias Stadiates descended first. The water off Antikythera drops away quickly, and Stadiates found himself at a depth of roughly 60 meters, nearly 200 feet, in water so dark that the world above ceased to exist. What he found on the seafloor was not sponges. He surfaced in a state of near panic. Some accounts say he was babbling about bodies, heaps of dead men and horses scattered across the ocean floor. His crewmates thought the nitrogen had gotten to him, that the depth had poisoned his mind. Narcosis was a common hazard of the trade, and the hallucinations it produced were well known among divers. But Kontos, the captain, was curious enough, or perhaps stubborn enough, to go down himself. What Kontos found was not a hallucination. It was a shipwreck, an ancient vessel, enormous by the standards of any era, lying broken across the rocky seabed. The bodies Stadiates had seen were not flesh and bone. They were bronze and marble, statues, dozens of them, life-sized figures of men and horses, their green-black patina blending with the dark water, their empty eyes staring up through 2,000 years of silence.
The divers had stumbled upon what would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. The wreck dated to approximately 70 to 60 BCE, the twilight years of the Roman Republic, and the ship appeared to have been a luxury cargo vessel, likely traveling from the eastern Mediterranean toward Rome. It carried treasures that would have made any Roman patrician weep with desire. Bronze statues of extraordinary craftsmanship, marble sculptures, glassware, jewelry, coins, and amphorae filled with what had once been fine wine. Word of the discovery reached the Greek government, and by November of 1900, a formal salvage operation was underway. The Greek Royal Navy dispatched a ship to assist, and the sponge divers, the same men who had made the initial find, were employed as the primary salvage team. It was, by any measure, a remarkable arrangement. These were not trained archaeologists. They had no formal education in antiquities or preservation. They were sponge divers, and they were being asked to bring up the treasures of an ancient civilization, using nothing more than their lungs, their ropes, and a courage that bordered on recklessness. The work was grueling and extraordinarily dangerous. The depth of the wreck, nearly 200 feet, meant that each dive carried the risk of decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, or drowning. The divers worked in near total darkness, feeling their way along the corroded hull, prying loose statues that weighed hundreds of pounds. One diver was paralyzed during the operation. 2 others died. These are facts that are often omitted from the story, sanitized away in favor of the romance of discovery. But they matter. They remind us that knowledge has a cost, and that cost is sometimes paid in human life. Over the course of nearly a year, the salvage operation brought up an astonishing collection of artifacts. The bronze statues alone would have made the Antikythera wreck one of the most important underwater archaeological finds ever recorded. A life-sized bronze figure,
now known as the Antikythera youth, possibly a depiction of Paris or Perseus, emerged from the water in pieces, his body green with oxidation, but his form still radiating the confident grace of Hellenistic sculpture. There were fragments of marble statues, their surfaces softened by centuries of saltwater erosion. There were coins that helped date the wreck. There were luxury goods that spoke to the extraordinary wealth of whoever had commissioned this voyage. But among the statues and the coins and the amphorae, there was something else, something small, something that no one, at first, thought to look at twice. It was a lump of corroded bronze, roughly the size of a large book, encrusted with marine growth and calcium deposits. When it was first hauled up from the wreck and placed alongside the gleaming statues and the delicate glassware, it looked like nothing. Debris, the kind of shapeless, corroded mass that 2,000 years of the bottom of the sea tends to produce. It was catalogued, stored, and largely ignored. Months passed. The lump sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, unremarked upon, while scholars and curators lavished their attention on the statues, the jewelry, the coins, the beautiful things, the obviously valuable things. The lump was ugly. It was formless. It did not photograph well, and it did not tell a story that anyone was prepared to hear. And then, it cracked.
Whether through the slow process of drying or through some minor handling, the corroded mass split open, and what lay inside defied every assumption that the archaeological world had ever held about the ancient Greeks. Inside the lump were gears, bronze gears, precisely cut, interlocking with a complexity that seemed impossible. Tiny teeth, carefully shaped, meshing together in configurations that suggested not random metalwork, but deliberate, purposeful engineering. There were inscriptions, Greek text, finely etched into the bronze surfaces, too small to read with the naked eye, but clearly intentional. The scholars who first examined the fragments did not know what to make of them. The technology on display, precision gearing, differential mechanisms, calibrated scales, was not supposed to exist in the ancient world. The established narrative of technological progress held that such devices were a product of the medieval period at the earliest, perhaps the Renaissance. The idea that the ancient Greeks had built a machine of this complexity was not merely surprising, it was, to many, offensive. It challenged the comfortable linear story of human progress, the story that says we started in ignorance and climbed steadily toward enlightenment. And so the mechanism was, in a sense, dismissed a second time. Not thrown away, it was, after all, ancient and therefore worthy of preservation, but set aside, filed under curiosities, acknowledged but not understood. The scholars of the early 20th century looked at it, noted that it was unusual, and then turned back to the statues, the beautiful things, the things that made sense. And here is where this story intersects with the thread that has been winding through our evening together. Because the Antikythera mechanism, as it would come to be called, is not simply a marvel of ancient engineering, it is a testament to forgetting. Consider what had to happen for this device to end up at the bottom of the sea, unknown and unimagined for 2 millennia. Someone built it, Someone, or more likely, a tradition of someone's, a lineage of craftsmen and astronomers and mathematicians, developed the theoretical knowledge, the metallurgical skill, and the mechanical ingenuity required to construct a device that could predict eclipses, track the cycles of the moon, and model the movements of the known planets. This was not the work of a single genius in a single afternoon. This was the accumulated output of generations of thought. And then it vanished. Not just the device itself, the knowledge behind it, the entire tradition of precision gearing that the mechanism represents disappeared from the historical record for over 1,000 years. When similar devices finally reappeared in medieval Europe, their creators had no idea that the Greeks had gotten there first. They were reinventing a wheel that had already been invented, lost, and forgotten. How does that happen? How does a civilization capable of building something this extraordinary simply lose the ability to build it? How does knowledge that precise, that painstaking, that hard-won, how does it just evaporate?
The shipwreck off Antikythera gives us a partial answer, though it is not a comforting one. The mechanism was found on a Roman cargo ship. It was, in all likelihood, being transported as a curiosity, perhaps a trophy, perhaps a diplomatic gift, perhaps simply a luxury item for a wealthy collector who admired Greek ingenuity the way one might admire a fine painting. The Romans, for all their extraordinary achievements in law, engineering, and governance, were not particularly interested in theoretical science. They were pragmatists. They built roads and aqueducts and armies. They conquered the people who built mechanisms like this one, and in conquering them, they inherited their treasures without inheriting their knowledge. There is a metaphor here that is almost too neat, almost too perfectly illustrative of the way civilizations consume one another. The mechanism, this pinnacle of Greek astronomical knowledge, was reduced to cargo, an object to be shipped across the sea, admired for its craftsmanship, perhaps displayed in a Roman villa as evidence of the owner's refined taste. But the science behind it, the mathematics, the years of careful observation and painstaking calibration, that was not something you could load onto a ship. And so when the ship sank, when the storms off Antikythera drove that heavy-laden vessel onto the rocks and sent its cargo tumbling into the deep, the mechanism sank with it, and the knowledge sank too. Not literally, of course. The knowledge had been sinking for decades, perhaps centuries, as the political and cultural conditions that had nurtured Greek theoretical science eroded under the weight of empire, war, and shifting priorities. The sponge divers who found the wreck in 1900 had no idea what they were looking at. The scholars who cataloged the find had no framework for understanding it. And for decades after its discovery, the mechanism would remain one of the most misunderstood, most underestimated, and most quietly revolutionary objects ever pulled from the earth. Or, in this case, from the sea. Let us stay here for a moment. Let us stay with the image of that corroded lump of bronze sitting on a shelf in a museum in Athens, waiting patiently, silently, for someone to crack it open and discover what lay inside. Because that image, I think, tells us something essential about the relationship between the past and the present. The past does not announce itself. It does not come to us polished and labeled and ready for display. It comes to us broken, encrusted, unrecognizable. And it asks us, quietly, without urgency, whether we are willing to look closely enough to see what it has to offer. The sponge divers were willing to look. They risked their lives, some of them lost their lives, to bring these fragments to the surface. The question that remained in those early years of the 20th century was whether the scholars and the scientists would be willing to look just as closely, whether they would have the courage to let go of what they thought they knew about the ancient world and allow a corroded lump of bronze to tell them a different story. That story, the story of what the mechanism actually was and what it tells us about the minds that built it, is where we are headed next. But for now, let us sit with the shipwreck. Let us sit with the divers and the statues and the lump that no one thought to examine. Let us sit with the silence of the sea and the patience of the past and the extraordinary fragility of knowledge. Because if there is one thing the Antikythera mechanism teaches us, it is this: the most important things are not always the most obvious ones. Sometimes the greatest discovery is the one that looks like nothing at all. For more than half a century, the corroded fragments of the Antikythera mechanism sat in quiet obscurity. Scholars knew they existed. A few had published tentative papers suggesting that the device was some kind of astronomical instrument, perhaps an astrolabe, perhaps a planetarium of rudimentary design. But these early interpretations were cautious, almost apologetic, as though the researchers themselves were embarrassed by what the evidence seemed to be telling them. Because what the evidence seemed to be telling them was impossible. It was not until 1959 that a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price began the work that would finally crack the mechanism open. Not physically this time, but intellectually. Price spent years studying the fragments, painstakingly cataloging the gears, measuring the teeth, tracing the inscriptions. What he eventually published in a landmark 1974 paper titled Gears from the Greeks was nothing less than a revolution in our understanding of ancient technology. The device, Price argued, was a hand-powered mechanical computer, not a computer in the modern electronic sense, of course, but a computational machine nonetheless, a device designed to calculate and display the positions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. It could predict lunar and solar eclipses. It tracked the metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which the phases of the moon recur on the same days of the solar year. It modeled the irregular, elliptical orbit of the moon using a sophisticated pin and slot mechanism that accounted for lunar anomaly, the fact that the moon does not move at a constant speed across the sky.
Let that settle for a moment. A device built more than 2,000 years ago, roughly 150 to 100 BCE, during the late Hellenistic period, could model the variable speed of the moon's orbit. This is not simple mechanics. This is applied astronomical theory of extraordinary sophistication, translated into bronze and built with a precision that modern watchmakers have described as breathtaking. The mechanism contained at least 30 interlocking gears, possibly more. Some fragments remain too corroded or too damaged to analyze with certainty. The teeth of these gears were cut in equilateral triangles, each one approximately 1.5 millimeters in size. To put that in perspective, the gears inside a modern wristwatch are typically larger. Whoever built this device was working at a scale of miniaturization that we associate with the European clockmaking tradition of the 14th and 15th centuries, a tradition that would not emerge for another 1,500 years. And it was not merely precise, it was elegant. The mechanism was housed in a wooden case roughly the size of a shoebox, with bronze dials on the front and back. The front dial displayed the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar.
The rear dials tracked eclipse cycles and the schedule of the Pan-Hellenic Games, including the Olympics. A small handle on the side allowed the operator to turn the gears, advancing the mechanism through time, forward or backward, and reading the positions of the heavenly bodies on the calibrated dials. It was, in the most literal sense, a machine for navigating time itself. The scholarly world did not respond to Price's findings with uniform enthusiasm. Many classicists were skeptical, even hostile. The mechanism did not fit the prevailing narrative about Greek technology. The ancient Greeks, according to the established view, were philosophers and theorists, men of the mind, not of the workshop. They contemplated the heavens. They did not build machines to predict them. The idea that Greek craftsmen had possessed the skill to manufacture precision gears of this complexity was, for many scholars, simply too large a revision to accept without resistance. And so the mechanism remained controversial for decades. It was acknowledged as remarkable, certainly, no one could deny that, but it was treated as an anomaly, an on-off, a fluke of ancient ingenuity that proved nothing about the broader technological capabilities of the Hellenistic world. This interpretation was comfortable because it allowed the existing narrative to survive intact. Yes, someone had built an extraordinary machine, but it was an exception, not a rule.
It took modern imaging technology to finally, decisively silence the skeptics. In 2005, a team of researchers used high-resolution X-ray computed tomography, the same technology used to scan the human body, to peer inside the corroded fragments without touching them. What they found was staggering. The mechanism was even more complex than Price had realized. There were more gears than he had counted, more inscriptions than he had been able to read. The X-ray scans revealed thousands of characters of Greek text, essentially an instruction manual, etched into surfaces that had been hidden from view for 2 millennia. The text described the astronomical functions of the device in detail, confirming that it was not merely a display piece, but a working computational instrument of extraordinary ambition. The scans also revealed something else, something subtler, but in some ways more profound. The quality of the workmanship suggested not a prototype, but a mature technology. The gears meshed too smoothly, the engineering was too confident, the design was too refined to be a first attempt. This machine was the product of a tradition. Somewhere in the ancient world, most likely on the island of Rhodes, or perhaps in the intellectual circles of Syracuse or Alexandria, there existed a lineage of craftsmen who built devices like this, not one machine, but many. Not a single genius working in isolation, but a community of practice, refining their art over generations. And every single one of those other machines is gone, lost, melted down, broken apart, consumed by time and neglect and the indifference of conquering empires. The Antikythera mechanism survives only because the ship carrying it sank in deep water. Water cold and dark enough to preserve what air and human hands would have destroyed. It is, in the cruelest irony, the catastrophe that saved it. The shipwreck was the mechanism's tomb and its salvation.
This is the impossibility at the heart of the Antikythera mechanism. Not that it exists, but that it exists alone. That an entire tradition of precision engineering flourished in the ancient Mediterranean and left behind exactly one surviving artifact. That we possess a single specimen of a technology that was clearly the work of generations, and that we have no idea how many others were built, how widely they were used, or how they were eventually lost. The mechanism forces us to reckon with a deeply uncomfortable truth. Our picture of the ancient world is not merely incomplete. It is distorted. We have built our understanding of Greek and Roman civilization from the fragments that happened to survive, the texts that were copied, the statues that were buried,
the buildings that were built in stone rather than wood. But survival is not a representative sample. The things that endure are not necessarily the things that mattered most. They are simply the things that were lucky. And the Antikythera skinism was lucky. It was lucky that the ship sank where it did. Lucky that the water was deep enough to discourage casual salvage. Lucky that a crew of sponge divers from Simi happened to anchor in precisely the right place on precisely the right day. Lucky that one of them was brave enough or reckless enough to dive 200 feet into the dark and discover what lay below.
But for every mechanism that was lucky, how many were not? How many extraordinary devices, how many traditions of knowledge, how many centuries of accumulated ingenuity simply vanished? Not because they were unimportant, but because the ship didn't sink, the library burned, the empire fell, and no one thought to write it down. This is the question the mechanism leaves us with, and it is not a question with an answer. It is a question that simply sits there, heavy and silent, like a lump of corroded bronze on a museum shelf, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what it contains. And it is in that spirit, the spirit of looking closely, of peering into the gaps and the silences, that we turn now to our final mystery of the evening. We have followed the collapse of civilizations, deciphered manuscripts that refused to be read, knelt beside bodies preserved in peat for millennia, and held in our minds a machine that should not exist. Now we travel north, far north, beyond the warm waters of the Mediterranean and into the rain and fog and mud of Roman Britain, to the edge of empire, to the place where the roads ended and the legions marched into territory that Rome had never fully understood and would never fully control. We are looking for a legion, 9,000 men, soldiers, officers, engineers, camp followers, who marched into the mists of Caledonia and were never seen again. The 9th Legion, the Hispana, one of Rome's most decorated fighting forces, with a history stretching back to the days of Julius Caesar himself. They marched north, and then silence. No battle report, no monument, no mass grave. Just silence. Let us go and find them.
There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to the north. Not the warm, heavy silence of a Mediterranean afternoon, where the air itself seems to drowse beneath the sun. This is a different silence, wet, gray, watchful. The silence of moorland and bog and low cloud pressing down on hills that have no names. The silence of a landscape that does not welcome you, that tolerates your presence the way a sleeping animal tolerates a fly, with a patience that could end at any moment. It was into this silence that the 9th Legion marched, and it was in this silence that they disappeared. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what the 9th Legion was, and to understand that, we must understand what a Roman legion meant, not as a military abstraction, but as a living, breathing organism of human beings. A full Roman legion at strength comprised approximately 5,000 to 5,500 legionaries, professional soldiers who had signed up for a minimum of 25 years of service. These were not conscripts. They were career military men, volunteers who had chosen the legions as their path through life, knowing full well that the path might end in a ditch on the edge of the known world. Around this core of legionaries orbited a constellation of support,
auxiliary troops drawn from conquered peoples, engineers and surveyors, medical staff, smiths and carpenters, muleteers and camp servants. When a legion moved, it moved as a small city. Some estimates place the total number of personnel associated with a single legion, including auxiliaries and camp followers, at close to 9,000 souls. The 9th Legion, Legio Nona Hispana, the Spanish 9th, was among the oldest and most storied formations in the Roman military. Its origins are debated, but it was almost certainly active during the late Republic, possibly raised by Pompey the Great in the 60s BCE for his campaigns in Hispania. Julius Caesar himself commanded the 9th during the Gallic Wars, and the legion fought at some of the most consequential battles in Roman history. It was present at Pharsalus, where Caesar defeated Pompey in the civil war that would end the Republic. It served in Africa and in the eastern provinces. It was a veteran legion, tempered by decades of campaigning across 3 continents, carrying with it a weight of institutional memory and hard-won expertise that cannot be measured in numbers alone. By the time the 9th arrived in Britain, likely as part of the invasion force assembled by Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, it had been a functional military unit for over a century. Think about what that means. A century of accumulated knowledge, passed from veteran to recruit, from centurion to optio, from one generation of soldiers to the next. How to build a marching camp in hostile territory, how to ford a river under fire, how to hold a line when the line wants to break, how to sleep in the rain and fight in the mud and keep your gladius sharp when everything around you is rusting and rotting and falling apart. This was not theoretical knowledge, it was embodied knowledge, carried in the muscles and the habits and the instincts of thousands of men who had spent their entire adult lives learning to survive.
The 9th was stationed in the north of the province, initially at Lindum, the fortress that would become Lincoln, and later at Eboracum, the fortress that would become York. These were frontier postings. The comfortable, Romanized south of Britain, with its villas and bathhouses and neatly gridded towns, was a world away. The north was different. The north was Brigantian territory, and beyond the Brigantes lay the Caledonians, and beyond the Caledonians lay nothing that Rome had any reliable information about. Maps grew vague, intelligence reports thinned. The roads, those magnificent arrow-straight Roman roads that stitched the empire together like sutures, petered out into muddy tracks that wound through forests and across bogs and up into hills where the clouds sat so low you could not see the man marching 20 paces ahead of you. The 9th knew trouble in Britain. In 60 or 61 CE, during the Great Revolt led by Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, the legions suffered a devastating defeat. The legate Quintus Petilius Cerealis marched the 9th south to confront the rebellion, and the infantry was virtually annihilated. Only the cavalry survived, retreating to the safety of their fortified camp. The legion was rebuilt, Rome always rebuilt, but the scar of that defeat lingered. To be a soldier of the 9th in the years after Boudica was to carry the memory of catastrophe in your bones. And yet the legion endured. It was reinforced with fresh troops from the continent. It resumed its duties on the northern frontier. Archaeological evidence confirms its presence at York well into the early 2nd century CE. Tile stamps, inscriptions, the ordinary bureaucratic debris of military life. The 9th was there. It was real. It was doing what legions do: patrolling, building, garrisoning, projecting the power of an empire across a landscape that had never asked for it and never fully accepted it.
And then, nothing. The last definitive, datable record of the 9th Legion in Britain
comes from around 108 CE, during the reign of Emperor Trajan. An inscription found at York names the legion and its officers. After that, silence. The 9th does not appear in any subsequent record of the British garrison. It is not mentioned in the building of Hadrian's Wall, which began in 122 CE, a project so vast and so labor-intensive that every legion in Britain was involved. Every legion except, apparently, the 9th. Because by then, it seems, the 9th was no longer there. This absence is the mystery. Not a dramatic final battle, not a last stand on some fog-shrouded hillside, just an absence, a gap in the record where a legion used to be. 5,000 soldiers, plus their auxiliaries and camp followers, perhaps 9,000 people in total, who simply stop appearing in the documents. No transfer orders, no disbandment notice, no monument erected to honor the fallen, no official explanation of any kind. 9,000 people gone, as though the mist had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole.
The traditional narrative, the one that has captured the imagination of novelists and filmmakers and armchair historians for generations, is seductively simple. The 9th marched north, beyond the frontier, into the unconquered highlands of Caledonia, and was destroyed, annihilated by the Caledonian tribes in some terrible, unrecorded battle in the wilderness. It is a story that carries the weight of myth, the hubris of empire meeting its end in the rain and the heather, brought low by warriors who refuse to be conquered. It is a story that flatters us in a way, because it suggests that there are limits to power, that the wild places of the earth can still resist, can still swallow whole the machinery of civilization. Rosemary Sutcliffe immortalized this version in her 1954 novel, The Eagle of the 9th, and it has lived in the popular consciousness ever since. The doomed march, the ambush in the fog, the eagle standard, the sacred symbol of the legion's identity and honor, lost in the heather, never recovered. It is a magnificent story, and it may be entirely wrong, because the historical evidence, such as it is, does not clearly support the annihilation theory. And here is where the mystery deepens, where it shifts from a simple question of military defeat into something far more interesting and far more unsettling. Because if the 9th was not destroyed in Caledonia, then what happened to it? If 9,000 men were not killed in battle, where did they go? Some historians have pointed to fragmentary evidence suggesting the 9th may have been transferred out of Britain entirely, perhaps to the Rhine frontier, perhaps to the east, where Rome was engaged in ongoing conflicts with Parthia. A handful of tile stamps and officer records from Nijmegen, in what is now the Netherlands, bear the mark of the 9th Legion and date to the early 2nd century. If these records are genuine, they suggest the Legion left Britain alive and intact, only to meet its end elsewhere, perhaps during one of Trajan's eastern campaigns, perhaps during the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea in the 130 CE, perhaps in some other engagement that the sources have not preserved.
But this explanation, too, is incomplete, because even if the 9th was transferred, even if it survived Britain, it still vanishes. The legion does not appear on a list of active legions compiled during the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the mid-2nd century. By then, it was gone. However it ended, whether in the highlands of Scotland or the deserts of Mesopotamia or the olive groves of Judea, it ended completely. no successor unit, no continuation under a new name, no veteran colony established in its honor as was customary for legions that served with distinction. The ninth simply ceases to exist. And Rome, that most bureaucratic of empires, the civilization that recorded everything, that kept meticulous records of troop movements and supply requisitions and the daily password at every frontier fort, Rome left no explanation, no file, no memo, no official word on what happened to one of its oldest and most distinguished fighting formations. This silence is what makes the Ninth Legion different from the other mysteries we have explored tonight. The Bronze Age collapse is a mystery of scale, too many civilizations falling at once for any single explanation to suffice. The Voynich Manuscript is a mystery of meaning, a text that resists all attempts at comprehension. The bog bodies are mysteries of intention, sacrifices whose purpose we can only guess at. The Antikythera mechanism is a mystery of capability, a technology that should not exist when it existed. But the Ninth Legion is a mystery of record. It is a silence in the archives, a hole in the paperwork. And that is perhaps the most disturbing kind of mystery of all, because it suggests that even the most meticulous civilizations, even the ones that write everything down, that stamp their bricks and carve their laws into stone, can lose track of 9,000 human lives. Not through carelessness necessarily, perhaps through something worse. Perhaps through the slow, quiet process by which inconvenient facts are allowed to fade. A defeat too humiliating to record, a disbandment too politically sensitive to announce, a failure that served no one's interests to remember. We have returned once again to our central question. What civilizations choose to forget is as telling as what they choose to remember. And Rome, mighty, eternal, bureaucratic Rome, chose to forget the ninth. The question is why, and the honest answer, the only honest answer, is that we do not know. We may never know. The Ninth Legion marched into history, and history closed behind them like water closing over a stone. What remains is the silence, and the silence, as we have learned tonight, has its own story to tell.
Let us consider the possibilities. Not because we will solve this, we will not, but because the shape of what we do not know can sometimes tell us as much as the knowledge itself. The theories surrounding the Ninth Legion's fate have shifted over the decades, each one reflecting not only the available evidence, but the preoccupations of the era that produced it. We see the past, always, through the lens of the present, and the stories we tell about the Ninth say as much about us as they do about Rome. The oldest and most romantic theory, the one that has sunk deepest roots into the popular imagination, is the Caledonian annihilation. The Ninth marched north of the frontier, into the highlands beyond the Fourth Clyde line, and was destroyed in battle by the Caledonian tribes. This theory draws its emotional power from the landscape itself. Anyone who has stood on the Scottish moors in winter, with the wind pulling at your coat, and the clouds so low it seems to press against the top of your skull, can feel the plausibility of it. This is country that swallows things. Paths vanish into peat. Rivers appear from nowhere and disappear into nowhere. Sound behaves strangely. A shout dies within yards, and the silence that rushes in to fill the gap feels almost predatory.
The military logic is not unreasonable. The Caledonians were formidable opponents who had resisted Roman incursion for decades. In 83 or 84 CE, the Roman governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola had fought a major engagement against the Caledonians at a place the sources call Mons Graupius, a battle the Romans claimed as a victory, though Agricola promptly withdrew southward afterward, which tells its own story. The tribes of the north fought in ways that Roman tactical doctrine was not designed to counter. Guerrilla raids, ambushes in difficult terrain, scorched earth retreats that denied the legions the set-piece battles they excelled at. A legion caught in unfavorable ground, stretched thin by a long march through hostile territory, cut off from its supply lines. Yes, it could be destroyed. It had happened before, most infamously in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE, where 3 legions under Publius Quintilius Varus were annihilated by Germanic tribes in an ambush that haunted Rome for generations. But the Caledonian theory has problems, significant ones. The destruction of a full legion was not the kind of event that Rome could simply ignore or forget. When Varus lost his 3 legions in Germania, the aftermath was seismic. Augustus himself reportedly wandered the halls of his palace, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The numbers of the destroyed legions, 17th, 18th, and 19th, were permanently retired, never reassigned to new formations, as a mark of mourning and perhaps of shame. If the 9th had been annihilated in Caledonia, we would expect to find some echo of that catastrophe in the sources, a reference in Cassius Dio or the Historia Augusta, a memorial inscription, a policy response, a punitive expedition, a fortification program, something. The destruction of a legion was a wound to the body politic of the empire. It left scars. And yet, there is nothing. No lament, no retired number, although admittedly the numbering conventions become muddled in the 2nd century. No punitive campaign that can be directly linked to the 9th's destruction. Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 CE, is sometimes cited as evidence of a defensive response to the loss of the 9th, a barrier built because Rome had learned, at terrible cost, that the north could not be held by force alone. But this is speculation built on absence, and absence is a treacherous foundation.
The transfer theory offers a less dramatic, but perhaps more historically plausible alternative. We know that legions were routinely deployed across the empire as strategic needs shifted. A legion stationed in Britain one decade might find itself on the Danube the next, or in Syria, or in Egypt. The Roman military was, in this sense, genuinely global. Its units moved like pieces on a board that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Persia. The evidence for the 9th's transfer is slim, but not negligible. Several officers who are known to have served with the 9th in Britain later appear in records from other provinces, one in Anatolia, another possibly in the Rhineland. A stamped tile from Nijmegen, dating to the early 2nd century, bears the mark of the 9th. These fragments suggest that at least some elements of the legion left Britain and continued to serve elsewhere. If this is true, then the mystery shifts but does not dissolve, because even if the 9th left Britain intact, it still ceases to exist as a functioning unit at some point in the 2nd century. It does not appear on the legionary list compiled under Marcus Aurelius, which dates to around 165 CE. Something happened to it, somewhere, at some time, that was final enough to end over 2 centuries of continuous service. The transfer theory does not solve the mystery. It merely relocates it. Some historians have suggested that the 9th was destroyed during Trajan's Parthian campaigns in the 110 CE, ground down in the brutal desert warfare that characterized Rome's eastern adventures. Others point to the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, 132 to 136 CE, one of the bloodiest insurgencies the empire ever faced. The revolt devastated the Roman forces deployed to suppress it, and at least one legion, the 22nd Deotariana, is believed to have been destroyed during the fighting. Could the 9th have shared the same fate? It is possible. It is also unprovable. And this is the essential frustration of the Ninth Legion mystery. Every theory is possible. None is certain. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, too riddled with gaps to support a definitive conclusion. We are left assembling a jigsaw puzzle in which most of the pieces are missing, and the remaining pieces might belong to different puzzles entirely. But perhaps the most interesting theory, the one that resonates most deeply with the themes we have been exploring all evening, is the quietest one: the theory of administrative erasure. What if the Ninth was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event? What if it was not annihilated in battle, or wiped out by plague, or swallowed by the desert? What if it simply faded? What if it was gradually reduced by attrition, casualties that were not replaced, transfers that were not backfilled, a slow hemorrhage of manpower that drained the Legion of its strength over years or decades until it fell below the threshold of operational viability? And what if, when it finally ceased to function as a coherent unit, Rome simply, quietly, bureaucratically, without ceremony, struck it from the rolls? This is not a glamorous theory. It does not lend itself to novels or films. There is no last stand, no doomed march, no eagle standard lost in the heather. There is only paperwork. A decision made in an office in Rome by an administrator whose name we will never know, to discontinue a unit that had outlived its usefulness. A line crossed through a ledger. A number retired without explanation. And yet, this theory may be the most honest reflection of how civilizations actually lose things, not in fire and thunder, but in silence, in the slow accumulation of small decisions, each one rational in isolation, that together produce an outcome no one intended and no one recorded. The Ninth did not disappear in a single dramatic moment. It disappeared the way most things disappear, gradually, and then all at once.
We will never know which theory is correct. This is not a mystery that the evidence, as it currently exists, can solve. New discoveries may yet emerge. An inscription unearthed from a construction site in Turkey, a tombstone found in a farmer's field in the Netherlands, a fragment of papyrus preserved in the dry sands of Egypt. Archaeology is, by its nature, a discipline of surprises. The Antikythera mechanism taught us that. The bog bodies taught us that. The past has a way of surfacing when we least expect it, offering up its secrets on its own schedule, in its own time. But even if we never learn the fate of the Ninth, the mystery itself has value, because the mystery forces us to confront the limits of the historical record. It reminds us that the past is not a complete narrative. It is a collection of fragments, some preserved by intention and some by accident, and the gaps between those fragments are vast. 9,000 people lived and marched and fought and ate and slept and wrote letters home and sharpened their swords and complained about the weather and dreamed of the day their service would end. And all of that life, all of that irreducible human experience, has been reduced to a handful of tile stamps and inscriptions, and a silence that stretches across 19 centuries. The Ninth Legion is not just a military mystery. It is a meditation on the fragility of memory itself, on the terrifying ease with which entire communities of human beings can be erased, not by violence necessarily, but by the simple failure to write things down, or the failure to preserve what was written, or the failure to care enough at the crucial moment to ensure that what happened was remembered. And so we return one final time to the question that has been with us all evening. What do civilizations choose to forget? What do they allow to slip beneath the surface, into the peat, into the sea, into the administrative silence of an archive that no one will ever open again?
The Ninth Legion does not answer that question, but it embodies it. It is the question made flesh, or rather, made absence, a space in the record where 9,000 lives used to be, a silence that speaks, if we are willing to listen, of everything the past has chosen not to tell us.
And so we arrive here, at the end of a very long night, and the beginning of something quieter still. We have traveled a great distance together, you and I. We stood among the crumbling palaces of the Bronze Age, where entire civilizations, proud, interconnected, brilliant, fell not to a single enemy, but to a cascade of failures so thorough that even the scribes stopped writing. We watched the world's first great experiment in globalization collapse under its own weight, and we noticed something unsettling, that no one left behind a clear account of why. The silence was not accidental, it was structural. When everything falls at once, there is no one left standing at a sufficient distance to describe the fall. We turned the pages of the Voynich Manuscript, that strange, beautiful, maddening book that has resisted every codebreaker, every linguist, every algorithm thrown against it for 600 years. And rather than feel frustrated by its refusal to yield, we allowed ourselves to consider the possibility that some things are not meant to be decoded, that the manuscript's greatest gift may not be its content, but its mystery, the way it forces us to confront the limits of our own pattern-seeking minds. We want so desperately for everything to mean something. The Voynich Manuscript asks, what if the meaning is in the wanting?
We knelt beside the bog bodies, Toland man, Growballa man, the Windaby girl, and looked into faces preserved with such impossible tenderness by the very earth that consumed them. We grappled with the uncomfortable truth that these were not simply deaths, but rituals, offerings, that the communities who loved these people may also have been the communities who killed them. And in that contradiction, we found something profoundly human, the capacity to hold sacrifice and devotion in the same trembling hand. The bogs did not just preserve their bodies, they preserved a question about what we are willing to give up in the name of something larger than ourselves. We descended to the floor of the Aegean Sea and retrieved the Antikythera mechanism, that impossible arrangement of bronze gears that had no business existing 2,000 years ago, a device so sophisticated that it would take 14 centuries for anything comparable to appear again in the historical record. And instead of marveling only at its ingenuity, we sat with a far more troubling realization that knowledge does not accumulate in a straight line, that brilliance can be born, flourish, and vanish, not because it failed, but because the civilization that carried it failed. The mechanism survived by accident, swallowed by the sea, forgotten by history. How many other mechanisms did not survive? How many ancient breakthroughs are we not even aware we have lost? And finally, we marched with the Ninth Legion into the mists of northern Britain, 5,000 men who walked into the fog of history and never walked back out. We examined the theories, annihilation in the highlands, quiet transfer to another frontier, or the most haunting possibility of all, administrative erasure, a bureaucratic silence that simply wrote them out of the record, not with malice, but with indifference. And it was there, in that indifference, that we found the thread connecting all 5 of our mysteries. Because that is what this night has truly been about.
Not the mysteries themselves, though they are extraordinary. Not the theories, though they are fascinating. But the silences, the gaps,
the places where the record simply stops. History, we are taught, is the story of what happened, but that has never been entirely true. History is the story of what was written down, and what was written down was chosen by victors, by scribes, by bureaucrats, by the slow erosion of time and neglect. For every event that made it into the record, 1,000 others did not. For every voice that echoes through the centuries, 10,000 others have gone permanently mute. What civilizations choose to forget is just as telling as what they choose to remember. The Bronze Age kingdoms forgot their own collapse. The creator of the Voynich Manuscript left behind a text that forgets to be legible. The bog communities forgot or chose never to record the names of those they sacrificed. The Romans forgot the genius of the Antikythera mechanism, and the empire forgot an entire legion. These are not failures of memory, they are portraits of priority. They tell us what mattered enough to preserve and what did not. And in those choices, in those silences, we find a mirror. Because we too are making those choices right now. Every day, every civilization does. We are deciding in this very moment what future generations will know about us and what will slip through the cracks. The past is not a fixed thing. It is a story we keep telling ourselves, full of gaps we keep choosing not to fill. And perhaps that is all right. Perhaps the gaps are where the real wisdom lives, in the humility of not knowing, in the courage to sit with uncertainty, in the quiet acknowledgement that some doors, once closed, do not reopen, no matter how hard we knock. So as this night draws to a close, and the weight of your eyelids grows heavier, I want you to carry just one thought with you into sleep, that mystery is not the enemy of understanding. It is the beginning of it. Every unanswered question is an invitation, not to solve, but to wonder. And wondering, my friend, is the oldest and most human thing we do. Thank you for spending this night with me, here in our cozy corner of history. Thank you for listening, for wondering, for sitting with the questions rather than demanding the answers. The past will still be here when you wake. Its mysteries will still be waiting, patient as ever, wearing their silence like a crown. Rest now. You have earned it. And the next time you find yourself staring at something you cannot explain, a strange symbol, an old photograph, a name you half remember from a dream, do not rush to solve it. Sit with it. Let it breathe. Let it be what it is. Because sometimes the most profound thing history can teach us is how to be comfortable in the dark. Good night.